Hey friends! Glad you're here at Monkey D, FIC. We've cooked up something special. What if Luffy awakened all gears? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1. The drums don't lie. The sky above Onigashima was the wrong color. It had been wrong for hours. Bruised purple where lightning split it open, orange and furious where the fires from the castle roof climbed higher than they had any right to, black at the edges where smoke swallowed the stars whole. But now, as Monkey D. Luffy hit the stone floor of the rooftop for the second time in the same night, the sky turned a color that had no name. Something between red and the absence of red. Something that made the clouds pull back from the epicenter like they were afraid. Kaido stood over him. Didn't even look satisfied. That was the thing about Kaido that nobody wanted to say out loud. He wasn't cruel, not really, not the way King was cruel or Big Mom was theatrical about it. Kaido was simply honest. He had seen more fights than any living person on the sea, and he knew, with the flat certainty of a man who has tested every theory against every wall, that the wall always wins. You were good, Kaido said. And he meant it. Luffy didn't hear him. His heart had stopped. Not metaphorically. Not the poetic kind of stopping that heroes in stories experience when they meet their limits. His actual heart, the one that had been hammering out its ridiculous rhythm through Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd and the savage, screaming joy of Gear 4th, Bound Man, Snake Man, every form he'd thrown himself into, had simply stopped. The last punch had done it. Not even a special technique. Just Kaido's club, moving with the patient efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again, coming down on a chest that had nothing left to give. The clouds kept burning. The sea kept churning 600 meters below. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, Luffy's crew was still fighting, still bleeding, still holding the line because they believed he was up here winning. His heart stopped for 4 seconds. Then something inside him got angry about that. It started in his chest, which was strange because his chest was the problem, but it started there anyway, a sound more felt than heard, like a drum being struck by someone who doesn't know the word for gentle. 1 beat. Silence. 2 beats. The sound of it moved through him differently than his heartbeat had ever moved before, lower, rounder, more like the ocean felt during a storm when you were inside it rather than watching from the shore. Ba-dump. 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 Kaido heard it. He turned around. He had been walking back toward the castle's edge, already thinking about what came next. Big Mom would need handling, the Alliance would scatter without their captain, the cleanup would take less than an hour. He had turned away from Luffy the same way a man turns away from a fire he has already put out. The drum stopped him. Not because it was loud. Because it was familiar. Because somewhere in the architecture of Kaido's memory, layered thick with decades of slaughter and the dull ache of a man who has survived everything the world threw at him and found it disappointing, was a door he had nailed shut a very long time ago, and that drum was knocking on it. Impossible, Kaido said. It was the first time in 11 years that he had used that word. The white first. That was what the Wano samurai watching from the broken battlement would later describe, those few who were still conscious and coherent enough to form the memory properly. White, like seafoam, like fresh snow, like something that had never been touched by anything heavy. It rolled off Luffy in a wave rather than a burst, not explosive, not violent, but expansive, the way a held breath finally releases. Then Luffy stood up. He didn't scramble. Didn't push himself up on shaking arms the way he'd risen before, all grit and willpower and the specific kind of stubbornness that made people around him simultaneously want to cheer and cover their eyes. He simply stood. Like standing was the easiest thing in the world. Like gravity had politely offered and he'd said sure, why not? His hair was white. His eyes were open. And they were different. Not just the color, though the color had changed, warmed into something bright and gold and laughing even when his face wasn't, but the shape of them, the quality of them. Before, Luffy's eyes had always looked like they were seeing everything at once and processing approximately none of it, wide and honest and entirely unguarded. Now they looked like they were seeing everything at once and understanding all of it, and finding it hilarious. "Huh!" Luffy said. He looked at his hands. Stretched his fingers. His skin was rubbery and luminous in that way Gear 4th always produced, but it wasn't pulsing the way it usually did, all muscle strain and visible effort. It just was. Effortless. Like this was his natural state, and every other form had been him squinting at the sun. He looked at Kaido. "Okay," he said. "I get it now." Kaido launched himself forward. The thunder of a thunder bagua at full force crossed the rooftop in less than a second, the kanabo moving at a speed that by all physical rights shouldn't have been possible for something that large and heavy. Kaido hadn't held back. If anything, the look on Luffy's face, that open, curious, amused look, had made him reach for something deeper than he needed to reach all night. Luffy stepped to the side. Just stepped. No Sora, no gear technique, no rubber limb extension to extend his reach. He moved his body 6 inches to the left, and Kaido's club passed him so close it displaced the white fog around his shoulder, and Luffy was already in motion before the strike finished, his fist pulling back in a way that was simultaneously Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd, the steam-heated, blood-pumping velocity of one and the bone-white, gigantic inflation of the other, both at once, seamlessly, like two rivers meeting and becoming ocean. The fist that connected with Kaido's jaw was the size of a small house. It moved faster than anything that size should move. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the crack of hardened rubber or even the earthquake percussion of a Gear 4th Gum Kong gun. It was deeper. It was the sound the world makes when something that has been in it for a long time suddenly isn't anymore. Kaido left the rooftop horizontally, passed through the upper spine of Onagashima's castle roof with a sound like the whole building exhaling, and then he was outside and falling and the clouds scrambled out of his way. Luffy stood in the hole where Kaido had been. His arm was still extended. He brought it back slowly, examining it with the focused curiosity of a child who has just discovered a new trick with a toy. Then he laughed. It wasn't the battle-cry laugh, the rising ha-ha-ha that the crew knew meant he'd found his second wind. This was quieter. Genuine. The laugh of someone who has just understood a joke they've been sitting with for years. "That felt good," he said to nobody in particular. On the battlement, Kinemon was gripping the stone railing so hard his fingers had gone white. Beside him, Yamato had both hands pressed over her mouth. Not in horror. In something closer to reverence. "That's..." Yamato started. "Don't," Kinemon said quietly. "Don't say it yet." The sky turned white too. Not all of it. Just the part directly above Onigashima, a circular clearing in the smoke and fire and impossible storm clouds, opening up like an eye, and through it came moonlight that had no business being that bright, falling straight down onto the rooftop like a spotlight that the moon had been saving for exactly this moment. Kaido came back up. He came back up as a dragon, because he needed the mass and the distance and the room to think, and he burst through the underside of Onagashima's floating platform trailing fire and fury and the deep, battered pride of a man who had decided that this was going to be the fight that mattered. Not the last fight. Kaido had always believed the last fight was still ahead of him, had staked his entire existence on that belief, but the first one in a very long time that had given him anything to actually think about. He opened his mouth and the flame cannon that came out was burrow breath, full and unfiltered and hot enough that the air in front of it simply ceased to have moisture. It came at Luffy like a river of sun. Luffy breathed in. And ate it. Not literally, though in that moment, with the white hair and the golden eyes and the rubber body glowing at its edges, it wasn't entirely clear that, literally, was off the table, but he inflated, vastly, cartoonishly, his cheeks puffing out to an absurd size, and then he breathed out and the flame came back larger than it had arrived, heated by whatever engine was running inside him now, and it met Kaido's scales and he roared. The roar shook Wano. The lower floors of the castle lost 2 windows. Somewhere far below, in the Skull Dome's performance area, the fighting paused for 3 full seconds because everyone, combatant and spectator alike, felt it in their sternum. Luffy was already moving again. He stretched, both arms, both legs, simultaneously, the full rubber band pull of gear third and the velocity of gear second running through his extended limbs, and he caught Kaido's horns. Both of them. Hands wrapped around ancient bone, feet braced against the dragon's massive skull, and he pulled himself forward like a slingshot releasing, and the head but he delivered was gear third size at gear second speed wrapped in the crackling, wild, rubber-on hockey energy of gear fifth, and Kaido's head went down. Down into the stone of Onagashima's roof. Down through the roof. Down through the floor below it. Down through the next floor and the one after. Luffy rode him all the way down, hanging from the horns, laughing. They crashed into the performance floor in a heap of debris and silence. The silence lasted about 2 seconds, because it was the performance floor and every single person in it. Toby Rappo, Alliance fighters, pleasures, waiters, Queen's subordinates who had been valiantly trying to ignore the fact that their boss was apparently taking a nap upstairs, had just seen the sky punch through the ceiling and drop a dragon on the stage, and reality needed a moment to catch up with perception. Then the dragon shrank. Kaido in his human form was still massive, easily the largest human in the room, but he was human, and he was on his knees, and the crater around him was deep. He planted one hand in the rubble. Pushed himself up. His breath was ragged in a way it had never been before tonight, each inhalation costing him something. He looked up. Luffy had landed on a broken beam above him, sitting cross-legged on it like a gargoyle who'd heard an interesting story, watching him with those gold eyes and that infuriating, genuine, completely weaponless smile. "You're not angry," Kaido said. It wasn't a question. He was trying to understand. "Why would I be angry?" Luffy asked. "I killed you," Kaido said. "Twice." Luffy tilted his head. "Yeah. And then I wasn't dead anymore." He hopped off the beam, dropping to the rubble below and landing without any particular drama. "That's kind of how it goes with me." Around them, the room had rearranged itself. Alliance fighters who had been driven back were standing straighter now, reading the shift in gravity. Kaido's subordinates were reading it too, and the reading wasn't good. There was a specific quality to their stillness, the animal stillness of creatures who understand suddenly that the hierarchy they've been operating under has just been renegotiated. Queen had woken up at some point during the descent. He was sitting against a crumbled pillar, one hand pressed to his head, staring at Luffy with an expression that moved through confusion, recognition, and pure professional outrage in about 3 seconds. "That's," he started. "The Nika fruit," King said from somewhere in the smoke above. He had landed on a higher tier of rubble, mask still on, arms crossed. His voice was flat as a blade. "The real one." The room changed again. A different quality of silence. The name passed through the crowd like a stone through water, rippling out to every edge, and wherever the ripple reached, people went very still in a very different way. Not the stillness of tactical assessment. The stillness of something religious being touched by something real. Luffy looked at King. "Is that what it's called?" King didn't answer. "Nika," Luffy repeated, tasting the word. He didn't seem particularly moved by it. He looked back at Kaido. "Is that important?" Kaido laughed. It came out of him like something he hadn't planned, low and genuine and completely inappropriate for the moment, and a few of his nearby subordinates physically stepped back because they had never, in their entire tenure under the 100 Beasts, heard that sound. Not mockery. Not the laugh of a conqueror. The laugh of a man who has finally, after so many years, been surprised. "Probably," Kaido said. He rose to his full height. "Yes, boy. Probably very important." He rolled his neck. The sound it made was architectural. "But we're not done." "No," Luffy agreed. He cracked his knuckles, and even that small gesture produced a sound like distant cannon fire because the hockey layering his fist had nowhere to hide anymore. "We're not done." What followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. Battles have momentum that flows one direction and then another, ebb and surge, tides of advantage. What happened in that room, spilling back out through the floor, back up through the castle, exploding at intervals through walls and battlements and corridors, was more like weather. Kaido was the storm that had defined Wano for 20 years, ancient and absolute and terrible. Luffy was something the weather hadn't accounted for. He used everything. Not in sequence, the way he'd always cycled before, burning through gear second until the heat became a liability, switching to gear third size when he needed mass, forcing his body into gear fourth when raw power demanded it. He used it all at once, all the time, seamlessly, the way a musician who has practiced scales separately for years suddenly plays a chord and finds that the fingers just know. Gear second kept his movements liquid and impossible to track. Gear third turned a single jab into a geological event. Gear fourth's bound man form gave him the muscle pressure and armament density to meet Kaido's scales without shattering his arms. Gear fourth's snakeman gave him angles that didn't exist and trajectories that reversed on themselves like living things. And Gear fifth wrapped all of it in something that couldn't be quantified, a rubber reality, a zone where the rules of what a body could do were suggestions that Luffy was finding increasingly optional. At one point he stretched his arm the full length of the performance floor, caught a falling chandelier, and swung it at Kaido like a very creative mace. The chandelier exploded. Kaido didn't move because he hadn't needed to move in 15 years and wasn't planning to start now, but the force of it rocked him back a step. One step. Luffy noted the step with satisfaction and adjusted accordingly. At another point, Kaido transformed mid-combat, a fluid, practiced shift that had always given him a decisive advantage by changing the geometry of the fight, and Luffy, rather than retreating to find a new angle, simply grabbed the transforming body during the transition, stretched both arms around the dragon's neck while it was still half-formed, and pulled. The sound Kaido made was somewhere between dragon and human and profoundly undignified. Luffy's crew was watching. Most of them from various states of bloodied exhaustion, but watching. Zoro had gotten himself vertical by sheer bloody-mindedness, and was leaning against a wall with his sword sheathed, arms crossed, the cut from Kaido's slash still red across his chest. He watched Luffy fight with the specific expression he reserved for things that settled something in him, jaw set, eyes calm, the professional evaluation of a man who measures everything by his own highest standard and has just encountered something that resets the scale. "He's not switching forms," Zoro said. Chopper, beside him, had his hat pressed to his chest. "He's not switching because they're all the same form now," he said, and his voice had that quality it got when his medical brain was trying to process something that wasn't in any book. "His body has integrated them. Like different modes that used to require separate activation are just his baseline now." Zoro was quiet for a moment. "So what does that mean?" "It means," Robin said softly from where she sat against the support beam, one hand pressed to her ribs, "that Luffy is no longer fighting at his limit. He's fighting at his floor." That landed in the room like a stone. Frankie, arm half destroyed and running on fumes and the specific mechanical stubbornness of a man who had rebuilt himself once before, let out a long breath. "Then God help whoever gets in his way going forward." The fight ended, if ending is the right word for a gradual reduction in seismic activity, when Luffy hit Kaido with something that defied naming. Not a gum-gum attack. Not anything in the catalog. He had stretched back, both arms, both legs, his entire body coiled into a shape that borrowed from every gear simultaneously, and then he released, and the resulting strike was everything at once, the heat of second, the mass of third, the hockey density of fourth, and the reality-bending joyful savagery of fifth, all funneled through one central point. It hit Kaido in the chest. The Yonko went through the floor. Through the ground of Onigashima. Through the base of the floating island. Out the bottom, in a column of impact force that continued downward long after the mass it was carrying had stopped, so that the ocean below erupted upward in a pillar that people in Wano's capital saw from their windows and later described as the sea standing on end. Then quiet. Real quiet, for the first time in hours. Luffy stood at the hole where the floor had been. He looked down. He could see Kaido at the bottom of the crater, very far below, very still, dragon form reasserted as if the body had tried to protect itself with its greatest armor in the final moments. The scales were cracked in several places. The breathing was labored but present. Okay, Luffy said quietly. To himself. To the hole in the floor. To the strange, white light that was still haloed around him, dimming slowly now like an ember cooling but not cold, not yet cold. Okay. He turned around. And immediately tripped on a piece of rubble and fell on his face. The sound of the straw hats exhaling collective tension and then immediately bursting into hysterical relieved laughter was loud enough to wake Zoro, who had apparently fallen asleep standing up sometime in the last 3 minutes. Luffy peeled himself off the rubble, face flushed, grinning the grin, the real one, the full one, all teeth and no performance. He looked at his crew. They looked at him. For a moment nobody said anything, because there wasn't a word for the specific feeling of watching someone you love go through something like that and come out the other side with their whole self intact. Nami was crying. She wasn't making a production of it. Just tears running down a face that had been composed for too long, and she wiped them away with the back of her wrist and glared at him like it was his fault. Don't, she said, pointing at him, ever do that again. Do what? Die, she said, and the word cracked a little in the middle. Luffy opened his mouth. Closed it. He looked at her, and for a moment the white light caught on him, and he looked older than he was, not old, not heavy, but settled, like something had found its foundation inside him tonight, and was staying. Then he scratched the back of his head and said, I'll try. It wasn't the right answer. It was the only honest one. Usopp, who had been horizontal for approximately the last hour and was not planning to change that status anytime soon, raised one fist from the rubble. The greatest sniper in the world, he announced to the ceiling. Survived another impossible situation and is completely fine. You have 4 broken ribs, Chopper told him. Completely fine, Usopp maintained. Luffy laughed. Then he sat down in the rubble, just sat down where he was, and the white light finished fading and his hair went back to black, and he was suddenly just Luffy, skinny and bruised and wearing what remained of his jacket, which at this point was a concept more than a garment. He looked tired in the specific way he got after the big fights, not diminished but emptied out, the way a battery looks after it's powered something enormous, still itself, just quieter for a moment. Sanji emerged from somewhere in the smoke carrying water. Because Sanji always had water when the fight was over, it was one of those things nobody had ever asked him about because they'd learned not to question gifts. He handed a flask to Luffy without comment, and Luffy drank half of it in one pull. Your hair was white, Sanji said. Yeah, Luffy said. And your eyes were gold. Yeah. And you ate Kaido. Luffy paused. I didn't eat him. You basically ate him, Sanji said, and took a sip from his own flask. I reflected his. Luffy stopped. Tried to organize this thought. Failed. I did the thing, he said finally, gesturing vaguely at his own face in the international gesture of, you know the thing. Which Sanji did know, but was going to require him to be more specific as a matter of principle. The eating thing, Sanji said. Stop saying eating. You ate, Sanji. From the hole in the floor came a low, slow sound. Not threatening. More like a statement. The sound of a very large creature breathing through cracked ribs in the bottom of a very deep crater, acknowledging the end of something without surrendering the self that had existed before that end. Everyone in the room went still again. Then Kaido's voice came up from below, human now, faint but carrying. You have won, Joy Boy. Luffy frowned. I told you, he called back, voice echoing down through the floors. My name is Luffy. A pause. Luffy then. And I won because I'm going to be king of the pirates. Not because of any Joy Boy thing. Another pause. Longer. Those may be the same thing. Maybe, Luffy said. He picked up a piece of rubble and turned it over in his hands. But I get to decide that. Not a title. No answer from below. The breathing continued, steady and strange, and nobody in the room was sure if Kaido was unconscious or thinking, but neither situation seemed to require immediate action. Outside the castle, dawn was beginning to negotiate with the horizon. Not winning yet, the fires were still too bright, the smoke still too thick, but attempting. A thin thread of real light, actual morning light, feeling its way along the edges of Wano's eastern mountains. Robin stood up slowly, one hand on the wall, and walked to one of the room's fractured windows. She looked out at the light. Her expression was very still, the particular stillness she wore when she was processing something she had been looking for long enough that finding it required a moment before she could believe it. O'Hara had a book, she said. To no one. To herself. To the light coming through the smoke. We couldn't read most of it. The language was too old. But one section, we thought it was mythology. She was quiet for a moment. It described a warrior whose body was a song, who laughed in the face of any cage, who would return when the world was ready to be free. She turned from the window. She looked at Luffy, who was currently arguing with Sanji about whether what he had done could be classified as eating. I don't think it was mythology. The sun came up over Onigashima. And the sky, for the first time in 20 years of Kaido's reign, was the right color. The news reached the Marine base at Wano's coastal perimeter 90 minutes after sunrise. It came in fragments, intercepted Den Mushi signals, the testimony of a freighter captain who'd been sheltering in Wano's waters and witnessed the pillar of ocean from 3 nautical miles away, and finally a formal message from the Toby Rappo's surviving members, which the duty officer read twice, and then set down very carefully before going to find his commanding officer. The commanding officer read it once and immediately requested a priority line to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. The call connected in 11 seconds, which was extremely fast and suggested that the Fleet Admiral's office had also been receiving intercepted signals. I've seen it, Sakazuki said, without waiting for a report. Sir, if the Nika fruit, I've seen it, Sakazuki repeated. His voice was what it always was, granite. Absolute. The voice of a man who had converted every human feeling into policy so long ago that the conversion was total. Kaido is confirmed down? Confirmed down, sir. Also Big Mom. The Alliance appears to have, spare me the Alliance assessment. A pause. The sound of paper. The sound of a decision being made that would move like a stone thrown into still water, rings spreading outward until they touched every shore. Get me Voss. The duty officer stopped. Sir, that unit is classified at a level I don't have clearance to, then get someone who does. Sakazuki's voice didn't rise. It never rose. Tell them the fruit has fully awakened. Tell them it isn't Kaido they need to worry about. The line clicked off. The duty officer stood in the gray morning light of the observation post, the Den Mushi receiver still in his hand, listening to the static that followed the end of the call. Through the window, very far away across the water, he could see the shape of Onigashima, still half-shrouded in smoke, still lit amber at the edges from fires that were being slowly extinguished. Small from this distance. Everything was small from enough distance. He could also see the dawn coming in properly now, gold and generous and entirely uninterested in the calculations of powerful men. He put the receiver down, and went to find someone with the right clearance. Ch1 Chapter 2, The weight of a name. 3 days after the fall of Onigashima, Wano smelled like rain and wood smoke and food. The food was the important part. The people of Wano had been eating gray rice and contaminated fish for so long that the smell of real cooking, actual oil, actual spice, meat that wasn't rationed into translucence, moving through the streets of the flower capital was enough to stop people mid-stride and make them stand there with their hands pressed to their chests like they were trying to hold something in. Old women wept at fish stalls. Children ate until they couldn't move and then fell asleep on the street, and their parents didn't make them get up because the sight of a sleeping child with a full stomach was too rare and precious to disturb. Sanji had taken over 3 different kitchens simultaneously, and was treating the entire event as a professional and personal challenge, moving between them with the focused intensity of a general managing a 3-front campaign. He hadn't slept. He showed no signs of intending to sleep. His cigarette was a permanent fixture, and his expression was the one he got when cooking for people who genuinely needed it, which was entirely different from the expression he wore cooking for people who simply wanted it, something stripped of performance, something almost private. The Straw Hats occupied a large traditional house near the river, the kind with paper walls and wide covered walkways and a garden that had been tended faithfully by someone who was not there anymore, which Nami noticed and Robin noticed, and neither of them mentioned. They had been given the house by a man named Fugetsu, a merchant who had survived 20 years of Kaido's occupation by being very small and very quiet, and who had appeared on the morning after the battle with the deed in both hands, shaking badly and unable to make eye contact, to offer it to the people who had done what he had stopped believing anyone would ever do. Luffy had said thank you and asked where the kitchen was. Chopper had not stopped working since the fight ended. The infirmary he'd set up in the house's largest room was full, and the overflow extended into the garden, and Chopper himself was a blur, treating Zoro's chest wound, which was deep enough to have introduced itself by name, managing Nami's concussion, resetting the bones in Usopp's ribs with a focused efficiency that was more alarming than comforting to Usopp specifically, checking on Luffy every 2 hours with the frequency of a man who has watched someone's heart stop and is not prepared to stop watching just because it started again. Luffy kept telling him he was fine. Chopper kept checking anyway. On the morning of the 4th day, Luffy woke up before anyone else and went to sit on the engawa, the wooden walkway that ran along the garden's edge, with a bowl of leftover rice Sanji had left covered in the kitchen, and ate it while watching the water in the garden's small pond catch the early light. His bruises were mostly faded. His body healed fast even in normal circumstances, and in whatever new normal he was currently occupying, fast had accelerated to something Chopper kept documenting with barely suppressed scientific excitement. He was trying to figure out what was different. Not physically. Physically it was straightforward enough. His body had settled into something that felt less like a new gear and more like a door that had always been there, finally opening all the way. What he was trying to figure out was the thing underneath that, the thing he couldn't quite catch when he reached for it. He stretched his arm absently, watching it extend across the garden to the pond's edge, his fingers dipping into the water. The water rippled. He brought his arm back. He had done it without thinking, the same way breathing was without thinking. Before, every gear had required activation, focus, a deliberate physical process, and a mental commitment. Now there was none of that. It was all just him, all the time. That should have felt like more, he thought. More weight. More responsibility. The kind of thing that made you sit up straight. He ate another spoonful of rice. He felt fine. He felt, actually, more like himself than he had since before the Paramount War, since before losing Ace, since before all the years of chasing and losing and pushing. Like a version of himself that had been waiting somewhere quiet and patient had finally been given the go-ahead. He heard Zoro before he saw him, the specific gait of a man managing a significant chest wound by refusing to acknowledge it, the sound of each step carrying the effort he wouldn't put in his face. Zoro came and sat beside him. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had decided that this level of pain was not worth commenting on, and he sat cross-legged and looked at the garden and didn't say anything for a while, which was fine because neither did Luffy. The birds in Wano were extraordinary. Luffy had noticed this when they first arrived and kept noticing it. They were too colorful and too loud and acted like they owned everything, which was a quality Luffy respected. You integrated them, Zoro said eventually. Yeah. All of them. At once. Feels that way. Zoro turned this over. Does it feel different? Luffy thought about this honestly. Easier, he said. Zoro was quiet. Not the resentful kind of quiet, not the territorial competitive quiet that some people mistook for his default state. The thinking kind. The kind where something important was being measured against something else important, and he was being careful with the measurement. Good, he said. And that was that. They sat until Sanji appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea he'd clearly made with the same attention he gave everything, and he set them down between the 2 of them without comment, and went back to the kitchen because there were 300 people still needing to be fed and the logistics of that didn't get kinder just because everyone was having a moment. The tea was excellent. Luffy burned his tongue on it immediately. Zoro said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. The morning went on around them like mornings do, the sounds of the household waking, Chopper's rounds beginning, the distant sounds of the city coming to life with a vitality that was new and raw and a little fragile, the way things are when they've been kept in darkness a long time and aren't sure yet how to handle the light. Somewhere in the distance, a child was laughing. The kind of laugh that carries on air with no effort, effortless and selfish in the best possible way, taking up space without asking permission. Luffy tilted his head toward the sound. Smiled. Robin appeared on the walkway with a book, of course with a book, and sat at the far end and opened it, and appeared to be reading it, which she was, but she was also watching Luffy with the careful, patient attention she gave to things she was still assembling. She had spent the last 3 days doing what she always did after significant events, cataloging. Not for herself, or not only for herself, but because someone needed to understand what had happened at a level deeper than Luffy 1. She had spent 20 years believing the poneglyphs were her only path to understanding the Void Century and the truth behind the world government's founding lie. She still believed that. But something about what she'd seen on that rooftop, something in the quality of the white light and the drumbeat, and the way Kaido had said the word, Nika, with that particular combination of awe and recognition, it had added a new dimension to her understanding. Like a map gaining elevation. Robin, Luffy said without turning around, which meant he'd known she was there the whole time. What was Joy Boy? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was large and she was deciding what shape to give it. A person, she said finally. 800 years ago. Someone who made a promise he couldn't keep. What kind of promise? The kind that changes the world if it's ever fulfilled. She turned a page. The fishmen of Fishman Island have been waiting for an apology from him for 800 years. Luffy was quiet. That's a long time to wait for sorry. It is, Robin agreed. Well, I'm not Joy Boy, Luffy said. No, Robin said. You're not. She paused. You're something that happens after Joy Boy. Like what grows after a fire. She looked up at him over the edge of her book. What happened on that rooftop doesn't have a historical precedent, Luffy. I've read everything I've been able to get my hands on. The fruit has awakened before, to varying degrees. Never fully. Never all at once. Never like that. Luffy scratched the side of his face. So what does that mean? It means, she said, with the careful precision of someone who genuinely does not want to overstate or understate, that the world government is more frightened of you than they have ever been frightened of anyone. Including Whitebeard. This settled in the morning air like a leaf settling on still water, with barely a ripple because Luffy processed threat on a fundamentally different axis than most people. Good, he said, and finished his tea. The word traveled. Not through the garden, though the birds heard it. Through channels considerably less peaceful. 2 days after the battle, the first news ships had broken the reporting blackout that Kaido's control of Wano's waters had maintained for 2 decades. They'd come in from the northeast, small and fast, flying the flags of various news operations, their cargo holds full of blank paper and their den mushies hot with traffic. The Wano story was the largest single news event in 30 years and every reporter in the Grand Line knew it, and they descended on the external waters like a school of very fast, very noisy fish. The news coup network moved faster than ships. By the morning of the 3rd day, every newspaper in every port from the East Blue to the farthest reaches of the New World was running the same headline, though the precise wording varied by publication and political orientation. Emperor Kaido falls. Monkey D. Luffy declared 5th Emperor. The subheadlines were more varied, and some of them more interesting. Full awakening of the Nika fruit witnessed by hundreds, read one, above a grainy sketch that nonetheless captured something of the white hair, and the gold eyes and the absurd scale of what had happened. Joy Boy returns, read another, which was inaccurate but generated enormous circulation. The Drums of Liberation, read a third, which had been written by someone with a more philosophical bent and considerably better sourcing. The newspaper that landed in the Straw Hat's garden in Wano was folded in a way that put Luffy's face on the outside. The sketch of him was better than most. Someone had been very close or very observant, and it showed him in what appeared to be the transition moment, white light and black hair still fighting for dominance, and the expression on his face was the thing that made people who saw it stop and look again. Because the expression wasn't the fierce battle joy people expected. It was something quieter than that. Something that looked, disconcertingly, like relief. Nami found the paper first. She read it standing at the garden gate, her morning coffee in one hand and the paper in the other, and her expression moved through several stages before settling on something complicated. "Fifth Emperor," she said aloud, to nobody. "What?" Luffy called from the Engawa. She walked over and dropped the paper in his lap. He looked at it. At the headline. At the sketch of himself. He picked it up and turned it sideways, as if the orientation might change something. "Huh," he said. "Huh! Huh!" Nami pointed at the headline. "They're calling you an emperor, Luffy. An actual." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Do you understand what this means in terms of the bounties? The Marines? The attention from every pirate crew in the New World who wants to make a name? It means I'm getting closer to King of the Pirates," Luffy said simply. "It means you're a walking target," Nami said. "I was already a walking target. A bigger one. Nami." He looked up at her with those eyes, and they were just his normal eyes, dark and warm and direct, but there was something in the directness now that was different, a quality of settled certainty that was new. "When have people not tried to come at us?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. She grabbed the paper back and went inside to find the financial section, because there was also a report about what Wano's opening to the outside world was going to do to the international weapons market, and she had absolutely not been ignoring that information. Usopp, who had been listening from a window, leaned out and gave Luffy a solemn look. "She's not wrong, you know." "Yeah," Luffy said. "But she's also not right." Usopp thought about this. "Somehow that made sense to me." "Usopp." "Yeah? Go back to bed." "Already horizontal," Usopp confirmed, and the window closed. The formal celebration of Wano's liberation began on the fifth day, because the people of Wano were not going to let something like exhaustion and structural damage prevent them from throwing a party they had been waiting 20 years to have. The streets of the flower capital were hung with lanterns in colors Luffy had never seen used together before, combinations that should have clashed and instead made something that vibrated with a particular kind of joy, the joy of people who have been told for a long time that joy isn't theirs to have and have just been proven wrong. Momonosuke stood at the front of the celebration and he looked like what he was, a 28-year-old man in a young boy's body carrying the weight of a country that had just been handed back to him. And he spoke in a voice that wobbled only at the beginning before finding its footing, about the future of Wano, about what his father and the 9 red scabbards had sacrificed, about the alliance of people from outside Wano's borders who had fought and bled for a country that wasn't theirs. He looked at the Straw Hats when he said it. They were standing in a cluster near the back of the crowd, which was where Luffy had relocated them after approximately 45 seconds of being at the front. Because being at the front meant being looked at, and being looked at meant sitting still, which was something Luffy treated as a physical impossibility. From the back they had a slightly better view anyway, over the heads of the crowd, and Frankie had helpfully extended himself to his full mechanically assisted height, and was filming everything on a device that had no business existing in the One Piece world but that nobody was going to argue about. Yamato appeared beside Luffy somewhere in the middle of Momonosuke's speech and stood there with her arms crossed and her eyes bright, watching the proceedings with the focus of someone committing every detail to memory. "You're really leaving?" she said. "We have to," Luffy said. "There's more ocean out there." "I know." She looked at him. The thing about Yamato was that she was Kaido's daughter, and she was enormous, and she had the bearing of someone who had been fighting her whole life, which she had, and none of that masked the fact that she was also essentially a kid who had spent 2 decades reading about Odin and had just watched the person those stories were pointing toward do the thing those stories said was possible. "Take me with you," Luffy turned to look at her fully. You want to be a straw hat? I want to sail like Odin sailed. He grinned. That's the same thing. In the crowd in front of them, Nami heard this exchange and quietly began updating the crew manifest in her head. One more mouth to feed. One more set of coordinates to argue about. One more impossibly strong person to get in the way during fights she'd been trying to avoid. She added it to the list of things that were Luffy's fault and kept watching Momonosuke's speech. It was, she had to admit, a good speech. Even the part where he cried, which happened twice, was good. The celebration went until sunrise. The food held out longer than the food had any right to hold out, which was Sanji's doing, and nobody was going to examine the mechanics of it too closely. There was sake in quantities that suggested several weeks of advance planning by someone, and music from musicians who played like they'd been waiting for a real audience, and dancing that began formally in the traditional Wano style and evolved, as all dancing does when given enough time and sake, into something much less formal and much more enthusiastic. Luffy ate. An amount. A quantity that redefined what the word, amount, could encompass. He ate with the focus of a natural disaster, and the happiness of a person who genuinely could not imagine a better way to spend an evening, and somewhere around the 4th hour of the celebration he fell asleep under a lantern-strung tree in the middle of the festival like a person with absolutely no survival instincts, and also absolutely no enemies. Which was not true on the second count but was perhaps true enough on the first to make him comfortable. Robin put a blanket over him. She did it without drama, just set it on his shoulders and went back to talking to one of Wano's historians, who had brought 3 reference texts to the celebration because apparently that was the kind of historian he was. Nami watched this from a nearby sake table. She had a cup she'd been nursing for approximately 2 hours without meaningfully depleting it because she'd been too busy thinking to drink. The newspaper was folded in her pocket. She'd read it 4 times now, cover to cover, including the section she told herself she was only reading for the economic data. The reports from other crews, the first-hand accounts from the Tobirapo, the description of the white light and the drum sound that had preceded it, she'd read all of it, and what she kept coming back to was not the power, not the numbers, not the geopolitical implications, but a single sentence buried in the middle of page 7. Witnesses reported that the Yonko Kaido showed visible recognition at the sight of the awakened Nika fruit, suggesting foreknowledge of the fruit's true nature at a level currently unexplained. Kaido had known what it was. Which meant other people knew what it was. Which meant there were people in the world who had been watching for it. Waiting for it. And not all of those people were waiting because they wanted to celebrate. She folded the paper back along its original creases and tucked it away and looked at Luffy asleep under his tree, hair falling across his face, chest rising and falling with the untroubled rhythm of someone who had fought the strongest creature alive twice in one night, and then celebrated the aftermath by eating an ungodly amount of fish and passing out at a festival. She had known this man since she was a teenager stealing things to buy back her village. She knew every version of him, the version that ran headfirst into disasters, the version that made impossible things happen by refusing to acknowledge impossibility, the version that held grief so quietly it took you by surprise when you saw it surface. She knew the new version too, she thought. She'd seen the look on his face when he'd risen from that second death, and she knew what it meant. She'd been watching him long enough to know. He wasn't afraid of what was coming. And what was coming was going to be very, very large. 7,000 nautical miles from Wano, in a facility that appeared on no official map and was listed in the world government's internal documents under a budget line for administrative overhead. A woman named Voss sat across a table from a projection of a man whose face she had not seen in 6 years. The projection quality was excellent. High-end encryptions, military-grade den mushy technology that filtered even breath sounds below detectable frequencies. The face in the projection was not Sakazuki, who she reported to in name only, and not the cipher agents who served as intermediaries. It was a face that wore no expression because expression was for people who hadn't learned to communicate without it, and it looked at her with the patience of someone who had learned to wait long before waiting became necessary. Full awakening, the face said. Confirmed. Voss said. All forms. All forms. Integrated. Simultaneous. She tapped her fingers once on the table's edge. It's not a transformation anymore. It's a baseline. Silence. The kind of silence that in this particular room meant thinking, not absence. The Buster Call option was submitted by Admiral Kizaru's office, the face said. We rejected it. I know. It was the right call. Voss leaned back. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured and olive-skinned, with gray coming in at her temples in a way she hadn't bothered to address and hair pulled back with a practical severity that wasn't vanity, wasn't anything except efficiency. She had the kind of face that was difficult to place an age on, somewhere between 40 and whenever age stopped being interesting. You send a Buster Call at Wano right now, you killed 20,000 civilians and you hand every pirate crew in the New World a propaganda event. Luffy becomes a martyr. The symbol becomes permanent. We don't want a symbol. The face agreed. We want him handled quietly, Voss said. And we want it done in a way that doesn't generate another O'Hara. She said the name without particular inflection, just a reference point, the kind you drop into a professional conversation to establish shared history. She was watching the face in the projection, reading it the way she read everything, carefully, without assuming. You're familiar with the Joy Boy hypothesis, the face said. I wrote 2/3 of the hypothesis. Then you understand what a fully awakened Nika fruit means for the existing power structure. I understand, she said, that it doesn't have to mean anything, if we move correctly and quickly. She pulled a file from the table and opened it. Monkey D. Luffy is 19 years old. He has 11 crewmates, 3 allied pirate crews of varying reliability, and no fixed territory. He doesn't want territory. That's his weakness. She looked at the face in the projection. He fights for people. Remove the people and he fights for nothing. You're proposing a leverage operation. I'm proposing a precision operation. She closed the file. No admirals. No Buster Call. No headlines. She met the projection's eyes. I'm proposing we remind Monkey D. Luffy that being unchained has consequences for everyone around you. The face was quiet for a moment. You'll need a forward unit. I have Crane, she said. Crane alone? Crane is enough for the first phase. She said it flatly, without bravado, the confidence of a fact being stated. He's killed Joy Boy candidates before. 3 of them. None of them were fully awakened. No, Voss said. They weren't. She looked down at the file again, at the sketch someone had clipped from a newspaper, the grainy, extraordinary image of white light and black hair and gold eyes and that expression, that open, reaching, curious expression. She looked at it for 2 seconds, which was the most she was going to give it. Then she closed the file. Get me the roster of Luffy's known allies. Every port they've stopped at. Every person who's bled for them. She stood. I'll need 3 weeks. You have 2. Then I'll need better coffee, she said, and the projection cut out. She stood in the silence of the room for a moment. Outside, through the single narrow window set high in the wall, she could see a sliver of ocean, very dark, very far below. The facility sat on a promontory she'd chosen specifically for this angle. It was useful to be able to see the sea from wherever you were working, she had found, because the sea was honest in a way that rooms of powerful people generally weren't. She had been a pirate, once. A real one, not the kind that flew a flag and called themselves a pirate for the romance of it. She had sailed with a crew she had built herself out of people the world had thrown away, and for 4 years she had been free in a way that was so complete it was almost a physical sensation, the absence of walls, not just stone walls but all the invisible walls that structure had spent her entire childhood building around her. She had been free and her crew had been free and the ocean had been theirs. And then her crew had died. One by one, and then all at once, in the way that freedom always ended, not quietly, not with dignity, but with violence and loss and the specific horror of discovering that the world doesn't stop coming for you just because you've stopped wanting things from it. She had made a choice after that. A cold and clear-eyed choice that she did not regret and did not revisit. Unlimited freedom, she had learned, was not the gift it claimed to be. It was a beautiful, laughing, charismatic force that drew people in and then spent them. The cage was not the enemy. The cage kept the wolves out. She believed this. She had to believe this, and not because she'd been told to, but because she'd seen its proof written on the faces of everyone she'd loved and lost. She picked up the file again and walked toward the door. 19 years old, she thought. White hair and gold eyes and the laughter of something ancient. A boy who had died twice in one night and come back better for it. She thought about the newspaper expression. The relief. She closed the door behind her and went to find Crane. In Wano, that same night, Luffy woke up under his tree at approximately 3 in the morning because someone had accidentally stepped on his hand in the dark, yelped, and woken him. He sat up. The festival had wound down to embers and stragglers, a few musicians still playing something slow and wandering in the middle distance, a few couples sitting in gardens. He looked at the sky. Full of stars. Real ones, unobscured, the first time he'd seen the full Wano sky without smoke or Kaido's clouds overhead. He looked at them for a long moment, head tilted, the blanket Robin had given him gathered around his shoulders. He thought about Ace. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about Shanks, who he hadn't seen in years and who had handed him a straw hat and told him to return it when he became a great pirate. He thought about the drum sound. About how it had felt from the inside, not like power arriving but like a door opening into a room he'd always known was there. About how Kaido had said "Joy Boy" with a sound like someone naming a thing they'd feared and hoped for simultaneously. He pulled the straw hat from beside him. It had been sitting on the grass next to his head, which was where it always ended up when he slept, and put it on. Tilted the brim. Being a pirate, he thought, was the best thing in the world. The wide ocean and the people you picked up along the way and the places you went that were impossible, and the things you found out about yourself by crashing into problems too big for anyone sensible. The stars were very bright. Something was coming. He could feel it the way you feel weather in the air before the clouds arrive, not with dread, but with the anticipatory alertness of someone who has learned that what comes next is always worth meeting head-on. He grinned at the stars. Whatever it was going to be a great adventure. Chapter 3 Silk and Teeth. The Thousand Sunny left Wano on a morning that couldn't decide between fog and clarity, the kind of morning that kept promising to resolve itself and then didn't, so the ship moved through alternating veils of gray mist and sharp clean light with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like the ocean was pacing itself. Everyone was on deck for the departure. Even Zoro, whose chest wound had earned him a strict 3-day rest order from Chopper that he had observed for approximately 18 hours before deciding that standing was not technically bed rest's opposite. He stood at the railing with his arms crossed and watched Wano recede into the fog and said nothing, which was the most he ever said about the things that mattered. On the shore, growing smaller, were the people who had come to see them off. Kinemon and Denjiro and Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, the 9 red scabbards reduced and rearranged by everything the last weeks had cost them but standing straight because that was what they did. Momonosuke in his 8-year-old body, which he was apparently stuck with for the foreseeable future, standing at the front of the group with the dignity of a man several times his apparent age, one hand raised. Luffy waved back from the figurehead with his whole body, the wave of a person for whom half-measures were a foreign concept. His other hand was holding a drumstick he'd acquired from somewhere during the festival and had been using to drum on every available surface since, a habit that was already generating strong opinions from the crew. "You can stop waving," Sanji said from behind him. "They can't see you anymore." "I can see them," Luffy said. "That's because you have rubber in your eyes or something. My eyes are normal. Your eyes turned gold. That was different." Luffy kept waving until the shore disappeared entirely into the fog. Then he brought his arm back and sat cross-legged on the figurehead, and resumed drumming on his knee. "Where are we going?" "That," Nami said, emerging from the navigation room with a chart rolled under one arm and the expression of someone who has been thinking hard about a question for several days. is what we need to discuss. The crew gathered at the main table on deck, which Frankie had cleared of the 4 separate projects he'd had going simultaneously, each in various states of being improved from their prior existence. The chart Nami unrolled was large and detailed and covered with her own annotations in at least 3 colors, which in Nami's cartographic language was the equivalent of shouting. "We're in the New World," she said, setting weights at each corner. Past Wano, the natural next course runs through several contested stretches. She traced the routes. There are 2 Yonko territories that are now effectively vacant. Kaido's entire network is in chaos. Big Mom's crew has scattered, and that creates an instability that's already generating pirate movement. Every crew that was sitting on Kaido's edges is going to push inward. Every crew that was afraid of Big Mom is going to start testing the edges of her former territory. So the ocean's about to get crowded, Zoro said. The ocean was already crowded. Now it's going to be violent and crowded. Nami tapped the center of the chart. The safest course takes us here, through a stretch of sea between the 2 destabilized territories. It's a 3-day sail in good weather, longer in bad, and it connects to the next set of islands we need to reach to follow the Poneglyph trail. She looked at Robin. The next Poneglyph should be on Elbaf, Robin said, leaning over the chart with her chin on her clasped hands. Or connected to it. The Giant's Island has been outside world government reach for most of recorded history, which makes it the logical repository for something they would want buried. Elbaf, Usopp said very quietly. Several heads turned toward him. He had gone slightly pale in a way that his dark skin made complicated to read, and he was gripping the table's edge with the careful casualness of a person trying not to grip the table's edge. Problem? Sanji asked. No, Usopp said. Elbaf is just. It's the land of giants. The greatest warriors in the world. I've always. He stood up straighter. I've always wanted to go there. He finished, with an inflection that suggested this was true and that the wanting was accompanied by several layers of complicated feelings about it. Then it's decided, Luffy said. He was looking at the chart with his chin propped on his fist, the drumstick tucked behind his ear. Elbaf. We're not deciding right now, Nami said. I'm explaining the route. There are stops to make before Elbaf. Luffy said again, as if repetition would clarify. Luffy. He looked at her. We need supplies, she said. We need to resupply the medical stores. Chopper is out of several things that could be critical if we hit another major battle before Elbaf. We need to stop at an island. She put her finger on a point on the chart. This one. Mirela. Trading port, neutral territory, has a decent market according to the last charts. 2 days out. Luffy looked at the island. Looked at the line from the island to where Elbaf would be if this chart extended far enough. Okay, he said. Mirela, then Elbaf. Nami rolled up the chart with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had gotten what she wanted by phrasing what she wanted as an explanation. Exactly. The 2 days to Mirela were good days. The kind of days the Grand Line occasionally produced that felt almost like gifts, deliberate reprieves tucked between the things the ocean had in store. The weather held. The wind was cooperative. The current ran in their favor and the Thousand Sunny moved through the New World's water with the particular grace of a ship that had been built by love and genius and was operating in its element. Frankie spent both days performing what he called post-engagement structural assessment, and what the rest of the crew understood as Frankie explaining to the Sunny that it did great, and now he was going to make it even better. He talked to the ship while he worked. Nobody found this strange. Yamato adapted to ship life with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for it. She was large for the ship, not impossibly so, but enough that certain below-deck passages required her to duck and that her preferred sleeping position occupied a space that could have housed 2 normal people comfortably. She didn't seem to notice or care. She spent the first day learning where everything was with the focused inventory taking of someone building a mental map, and the second day asking questions about navigation from Nami, who answered them with a thoroughness that surprised even herself because Yamato asked genuinely good questions. You're actually interested in this? Nami said on the second afternoon, looking up from the compass she was calibrating. My father controlled Wano for 20 years. Yamato said. He knew every current, every wind pattern, every safe harbor in his territory. He told me once that the person who controls the routes controls the world. She paused. I always thought he was wrong about most things. I think he was right about that. Nami looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression she used when she was recalibrating someone. He was right about that. Below deck, in the space they'd converted to a training area, Luffy was learning himself. It was less dramatic than it sounded. He wasn't powering up or testing limits or performing the kind of training montage that the situation might have warranted. He was sitting in the middle of the floor, cross-legged, eyes closed, doing what he could only describe as listening to his own body. He had discovered, somewhere in the second day, that the integration wasn't total in the sense of being finished. It was total in the sense of being available. Everything was there, all at once, all the time. But using it, really using it, precisely, purposefully, the way a hand doesn't just exist at the end of your arm but can thread a needle, or catch a fly or express comfort, that took something different from the old way. Before, each gear had been a decision. A gear change. Now it was all one transmission, and he was still learning the feel of it. He extended one finger. Just one. And he pushed the gear's second circulation into that finger alone, the heat and speed of it, leaving the rest of his body completely neutral. The finger blurred. He could feel the temperature difference between it and his hand. Then he pulled it back, all of it, and extended the gear third inflation instead, just the fingertip, which swelled to the size of a small melon before he released it. He sat with this for a while. Combining them. Separating them. Finding the edges. Zoro appeared in the doorway, the wrapping around his chest fresh. Chopper had just redone it and grumbled audibly the entire time about patients who didn't respect the healing process. He leaned in the doorway and watched Luffy run through variations with the calm, assessing air of someone watching a very interesting chess game. You're getting more precise, Zoro said. I was always precise, Luffy said. Zoro's expression communicated several things about this statement without requiring words. Okay, Luffy conceded. More precise. Good. Zoro pushed off the doorframe. Because winning through brute force against the next thing we run into isn't going to be enough. He said it without particular drama, just the fact being acknowledged. Whoever comes after us next isn't going to be Kaido. Kaido was strong, Luffy said, opening his eyes. Kaido fought you straight up, Zoro said. The next problem won't. He left. Luffy sat with that for a while too. It felt true. He had a sense, not specific yet, more like the feeling of weather in the air before it arrived, that the thing approaching them was going to require something different. Not more power. Something sideways from power. He filed it, and went up for dinner. Mirela appeared on the third morning as a shape on the horizon that gradually resolved into a port city built vertically on a cliff face, the way cliff-face cities are in the New World, stacked and precarious, and somehow entirely functional, with docking facilities at the base and markets and residences rising in terrace levels above, connected by lifts and staircases and, at the highest levels, a series of rope bridges that swayed cheerfully in the wind. The harbor was busy. Not Wano post-liberation busy, but the ordinary busy of a trading port that served multiple factions and had learned to benefit from their conflicts rather than be crushed by them. Mirela flew a neutral flag, white with an open circle on it, the symbol of an island that belonged to no emperor and paid tribute to no single power, and the ships in its harbor represented at least 8 different affiliations, which under normal circumstances was impressive diplomacy and under current circumstances, with 2 Yonko territories in flux, was something closer to a miracle. Nami handled the docking negotiations with the harbor master herself and came back with a berth allocation, a provisional market pass, and a price that she considered reasonable and the harbor master considered a loss, which meant it was probably fair. She divided the crew into supply teams with the organizational efficiency of a general who has done this many times and has opinions about how it goes wrong. Medical supplies with Chopper. Food stores with Sanji. Ship materials with Frankie. Navigation charts with herself. General supplies with Usopp, who was also the best person to send to markets because his instinct for spotting value was second only to his instinct for accidentally befriending strangers who turned out to be useful. "What about me?" Luffy asked. "You," Nami said, pointing at him. "Stay with the ship." "What? Why?" She held up the newspaper, which she had now folded and refolded so many times the headline was partially obscured but not completely. "Because you are currently the most wanted man in the world, probably, and every bounty hunter on this island already knows your face, and if you go into that market with that hat on it will be a diplomatic incident inside of 4 minutes. I'll be careful. You will be on the ship," Nami said. "Nami, Luffy." She met his eyes. "The supplies take 3 hours. 3 hours, and then we leave. And I need those 3 hours to not include a fight with everyone on this island." She paused, and then in a lower voice, "Please." He looked at her. The please was the thing. She didn't use it often, and when she did she meant it. 3 hours, he said. She exhaled. 3 hours. It took slightly under 3 hours for everything to go wrong, which was actually better than Nami's private estimate. She was at the chart sellers, a shop on the 3rd level that smelled of ink and old paper and the specific anxiety of someone who understood that good cartography was the difference between life and death in the New World, negotiating over a set of islands north of Elbaf charts that were either extremely rare or extremely fabricated, when her den mushy went off. It was Usopp's frequency. She answered it. "Nami," Usopp said, and his voice had the flat quality it got when he was scared but was operating beyond the fear rather than inside it. "You need to know something. Tell me. There are people watching the Sunny." She went still. The chart seller continued his pitch. She held up one finger without looking at him. "Define watching. 3 ships in the harbor. They were here when we arrived, and they've repositioned since we docked. Subtle, but the angles changed. They're not facing our ship. But 3 ships simultaneously adjusting their facing slightly toward us and then stopping." His voice dropped. "These aren't bounty hunters, Nami. Bounty hunters don't move like this." Her hand was already rolling up the charts she'd been examining. She hadn't decided to buy them yet, but she was buying them now because leaving without a purchase would draw more attention than buying them. "Who?" she said quietly. "I don't know. No flags. The ships themselves look merchant class, but merchant ships don't have that many people on deck doing nothing." She paid for the charts. Overpaid. Didn't wait for change. She was already moving toward the stairs. "Get back to the ship. Contact the others. Don't run." "I know," he said, and she could hear him already moving, his feet finding the rhythm of someone strolling when they wanted to sprint. "There's something else." "Of course there is. One of those ships, the middle one, I caught a glimpse of someone on deck. Through my scope." A pause. "Nami, there was a Marine on that ship. Not in uniform, but the way he stood, the way he was looking at the Sunny. Get to the ship," she said. "Now." She was already running. Chopper reached the Sunny first, which made sense because Chopper was fast and also because he had been in the medical supply district closest to the harbor and had gotten Nami's alert, while still carrying 2 crates of supplies, which he managed without slowing by converting them to his heavy point form without breaking stride, crates balanced on one enormous arm. Sanji was 30 seconds behind him, having received the same alert while in the middle of a transaction that he resolved by leaving cash on the counter and walking out at a pace that was technically not running. Frankie and Robin arrived together from opposite directions, which suggested they had encountered each other en route and made the decision to move together. Frankie had one hand already cycling into its weapon configuration, which was not subtle but was honest. Yamato was on the ship. She had not been assigned to a team because they had not yet worked out the logistics of taking her places without attracting attention, and she had spent the time sitting on deck sharpening her kanabo with the meditative focus of someone who genuinely found the activity relaxing. When the others began arriving with the controlled urgency of a crew that had been put on alert, she stood up and gripped the kanabo without asking because there was nothing to ask. 3 ships, Sanji said, stepping aboard and looking at the harbor with casual direction. His cigarette had gone unlit for the last 30 seconds, which for Sanji was a reliable stress indicator. Which ones? Those, Chopper said, pointing with the crates before he set them down. The 3 ships were where Usopp had described, merchant class in appearance, well maintained, no identifying flags, positioned in the harbor with the angles Usopp had noticed. I count 12 people visible on each deck, Robin said. Not looking at the ships directly. Looking at the harbor generally, her eyes moving in a way that managed to map the entire space without appearing focused on any part of it. But those are only the ones they want us to see. Nami arrived last, out of breath, charts under one arm. She took in the assembled crew in one look and then took in the 3 ships in another. Then she looked around the dock. Where's Luffy? She said. Silence. Everyone looked at each other. He was on the ship, Yamato said. He was here when you all left. But about 40 minutes ago he said he was going to stretch his legs. He said what? He said, I heard what you said. Nami pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead. She stopped. Controlled herself. Okay. We deal with this first. She nodded toward the 3 ships. Robin, what are they waiting for? Us to be separated, Robin said. Which we no longer are. So they'll move soon. She was right. It took approximately 2 minutes. The man who came down the gangway of the center ship moved the way dangerous people move when they want you to know they're dangerous and have refined the communication of it past aggression into something almost aesthetic. He was tall, compact in the way that people who train instead of bulk are compact, and his clothes were the kind of plain that costs more than decoration. He wore no weapons visibly. His hair was the color of old copper. His eyes, as he got close enough for the crew to read his expression, were almost colorless, a pale gray that in certain light looked silver, and that currently looked like ice. He stepped onto the dock in front of the Sunny and stopped at a distance that was calculated, close enough to talk, far enough that nothing he said could be described as threatening in any hearing. I'm looking for Monkey D, Luffy, he said. His voice was conversational. Friendly, even, in the technical sense of the word. Not here, Sanji said, not moving. I can see that. The man looked at the ship with the expression of someone double-checking their work. My name is Crane. I have a message for his crew. Leave it, Nami said. He looked at her. Something in the look made her want to step back. She didn't. It's not that kind of message, he said. It requires a conversation. Then you should have made an appointment, Zoro said. He had appeared at the ship's railing, arms crossed, and was looking at Crane with the focused attention of a blade being examined for quality. Whatever he was finding, his expression wasn't reassuring. Crane looked up at him. A beat of assessment passed between the two of them, not a challenge, not a threat, just 2 people with a specific kind of expertise recognizing each other across a distance. Then Crane looked back at Nami. You're heading to Elbaf, he said. The crew went very still. Not reactively. The stillness of people who have just had their navigation confirmed by someone who had no business knowing it. You stopped at Wano. You'll leave here in. He checked the sky, like reading weather. Approximately 40 minutes based on your supply schedule. Your course from here makes Elbaf the logical destination if you're following the Poneglyph Trail. He said Poneglyph without emphasis, a reference point, the way Voss said O'Hara. I'm not here to fight you. Then what are you here for? Robin asked. She had both hands loose at her sides and her voice was even. To let you know that the road to Elbaf goes through a strait where 3 of your allied pirate crews are currently anchored. He paused. They don't know they've anchored in the same place. They were directed there. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. By people who know that Monkey D, Luffy doesn't leave people he considers his behind. It landed like a knife in still water. The ripple went through the crew in sequence, Nami's breath catching, Chopper's hands going to his bag, Usopp's fingers tightening on his slingshot that he'd been holding at his side since he got back to the ship, Zoro's jaw setting. Who directed them? Nami said. Someone with patience and a very good intelligence network. Crane clasped his hands behind his back. The message is, you can go to Elbaf. Nobody's stopping you. But if you go to Elbaf first, those 3 crews remain where they are. He tilted his head slightly. In a strait where the current runs in one direction, the walls are too close for any ship larger than a cutter to maneuver, and where, in approximately 16 hours, a weather event of significant force will arrive. Chopper had gone white. They'll be trapped. Yes, Crane said simply. Why are you telling us? Robin asked, and there was something careful in the question, a probe for structure. Crane looked at her. For the first time, something in his expression moved, not warmth, but acknowledgement, the look of one precise mind encountering another. Because the message is for Luffy, he said, and you're his crew. So it's for you. He paused. And because the people I work for are not unreasonable. They simply want Luffy to understand that being what he is has a radius. And if we choose to go get our allies? Nami asked. Then you're free to do that. He said it without a catch, without a tell. Genuine. And then perhaps we'll speak again, under different circumstances. He turned and walked back up the gangway. Not hurrying. Not looking back. The crew stood on the dock for approximately 3 seconds after he'd gone. Those were CP0. Zoro said. Yes, Robin said. And those ships are going to stay in the harbor. Nami said, not really asking. Long enough to confirm we've taken the message. Robin said. Then they'll leave. This wasn't a battle. She was looking at the ship Crane had returned to with an expression that was doing a lot of quiet work. This was a demonstration. They wanted us to know they're watching and that they know things. They knew about Elbaf. Usopp said. They knew about the Poneglyph Trail. They have sources? Robin said. Good ones. So what do we do? Chopper asked. They all looked at each other. They all looked at the gap in the assembled crew that was shaped like a rubber-limbed idiot who had gone for a walk. Nami was already thinking through it, the strait, the timing, the 16 hours, the 3 allied crews who had been herded there like cattle into a pen, the calculation of sailing speed and weather patterns and distances she hadn't had time to plot yet, but was rough estimating in her head with the rapid precision of a navigator who had been doing this since she was a child. We can get to the strait in 9 hours, she said. If we leave now. If the wind holds. It'll hold, Frankie said. He looked at her. I can push the coup to burst if we need speed. Save it. She was unrolling the charts she'd bought, the ones she'd overpaid for on instinct, and spreading them on the dock, kneeling over them. If I'm right about the current pattern in these straits, they're not trapped yet. The weather event won't have closed the exit for. She traced it with her finger. At least 18 hours from now. Which gives us a margin. She looked up. But we go now. And Luffy? Yamato asked. Everyone's head turned toward the market district. He was already walking back down the dock toward them, eating something on a stick he'd clearly just bought from somewhere, the straw hat tilted at its customary angle, looking completely unconcerned. He was alone, which was the main thing. Not arrested, not in the middle of a fight, not trailing a mob of bounty hunters. Just walking back to his ship eating street food like a person who had gone for a perfectly reasonable walk. He saw the crew on the dock and the looks on their faces and the rolled charts and the tension in how everyone was standing, and his expression sharpened immediately, all the ease falling away like a mask that had only been sitting loosely anyway. What happened? He said. Nami stood up with the charts. She looked at him and compressed everything, Crane, the 3 ships, the Allied crews in the strait, the 16 hours, the CP0 intelligence network, the message, into the most efficient version of the story it could be given. Luffy listened. He ate the rest of the thing on the stick while she talked. He dropped the stick. His expression didn't move through a range of reactions. It went directly to one. Clear. Still. decided. Then we go get them, he said. We're going, Nami said. I was already, now, Luffy said, and stepped onto the ship. There was something different about the word. Not louder, not harder. Luffy didn't do those kinds of emphases, they weren't in his vocabulary. But there was a quality to the word that came from whatever had changed in the aftermath of Onigashima, a weight that was entirely his own and entirely new. The weight of someone who has felt the full extent of their own capacity, and is no longer operating from the edge of it. The crew moved. Ropes were cast off, navigation was set. Frankie made adjustments in the engine room that produced a low hum the ship hadn't produced before, the sound of something being asked to perform at a level beyond its design specifications and rising to it because it had been built by love. As the Sunny pulled out of Mireille's harbor, Luffy stood at the bow and looked back at the three ships. Crane was visible on the deck of the center one. At this distance it was hard to read his expression, but his bearing was unchanged, composed, watchful, professional. Luffy looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned back toward the open sea. He wasn't angry. Anger was for when you didn't know what to do next and needed the emotion to fill the space. He knew what to do next, which was go get his people, and after that he would deal with whoever had sent Crane, and he would deal with them completely. Nami, he called back without turning. Already on it, she said from the navigation room. The Thousand Sunny moved into the open sea with the wind on her left, and the current ahead and 9 hours between her, and a decision someone had made for them that they were in the process of unmade. In the center of the three ships now receding behind them, Crane watched the Sunny go. He had a den mushi in his hand and his other hand was open at his side, a habit he had from his fighting years when a closed fist meant committed weight, and he had learned the value of remaining uncommitted until the last possible moment. The line connected on the second ring. They're moving, he said. Expect it, Voss said. Her voice was coffee hoarse, which meant she'd been working through the night again. Which direction? Toward the strait. He paused. They didn't hesitate. Luffy made the call in under 10 seconds. Of course he did. A sound of papers. So he's predictable. That's one word, Crane said. A pause. What's another word? Crane looked at the Sunny on the horizon, watching the green of its sail catch the morning light. He thought about the 11 seconds between the time the boy had stepped back on the ship and the time the ship had cast off. He thought about the look on Luffy's face when Nami had given him the information, not the expected anger or fear, but that flat, immediate clarity. The look of someone who has no complications. Uncomplicated, he said. Silence on the line. Is that a problem? Voss asked. It could be, Crane said. Complicated people negotiate with themselves before they move. Uncomplicated people are already moving while you're still talking. He's 19, Voss said. Yes. Crane watched the horizon where the Sunny had been until it was gone, swallowed by the distance and the sea light. His people are in trouble. He's going to them. Everything else is secondary to him right now, which means we have 9 hours of him being entirely predictable. He turned from the railing. After the strait, he stops being predictable. We only need him predictable until Crane, Voss said. Don't use my name to refer to the operation, he said. That's not what I. She stopped. A beat. Then, precisely. We only need him predictable until the operation concludes. Everything after is a different problem. Crane walked below decks. His cabin was small and functional and contained, on the one shelf above the bunk, a single item that was not tactical equipment. It was a water-stained journal, old enough that the cover had gone soft and the initials on it had faded to illegibility. He had not opened it in 3 years. He didn't open it now. He sat on the bunk and looked at the shelf and thought about an uncomplicated boy moving at full speed toward whatever came next. There's something you should know, he said into the den mushi. Tell me. I've killed 3 Joy Boy candidates, he said. All 3 were powerful. All 3 had partial awakenings of the Nika fruit. And all 3 He stopped. Started again. All three had people they were protecting. And when those people became threatened, they stopped being fighters and started being desperate. He looked at his hand, the open one, the uncommitted one. Desperate people make mistakes. That's the point, Voss said. Yes, Crane said. But Monkey D. Luffy isn't going to be desperate. He looked at the journal on the shelf. He's going to be happy. A long silence. Explain, Voss said. Going to save people he loves, Crane said. In his mind, this isn't a crisis. This is a good day. He gets to fight for something real. He turned off the lamp above the bunk. The cabin went dark except for the light coming through the porthole, gray ocean light, honest and cold and level. My previous targets feared losing what they were protecting. Luffy will be. He chose the word carefully. Joyful. Voss was quiet for a long time. Then we adjust, she said finally. Yes, Crane said. We adjust. The line closed. He lay down in the dark cabin and listened to the ship creak around him and the ocean moving underneath him, and somewhere very far ahead in the 9-hour distance, he could almost hear it, not really, not literally, but in the way that people who have lived their whole lives by instinct hear things that aren't sounds yet. A drumbeat. Low. Patient. Getting closer. Chapter 4. All of it. All at once the strait appeared on the horizon 7 hours after Mirela, not 9, because Nami had found a current that shaved 2 hours off the estimate and ridden it with the aggressive confidence of a navigator who treats weather systems as personal opponents and wins most of the time. The weather event Crane had described was already visible from a distance, a wall of dark clouds sitting on the horizon above the strait's entrance like something that had been placed there deliberately, which it hadn't, but which the timing suggested had been accounted for by someone who understood how to read the new world's rhythms. The clouds were the particular purple-green of serious weather, the kind that carried lightning and surge waves and the sort of wind that turned good seamanship into survival seamanship. Still 3 or 4 hours out, by Nami's reckoning. Maybe less if it moved fast. The strait itself was visible before the ships inside it were. 2 rocky walls of island cliff rising straight from the water close enough that the space between them was in shadow even in midday, the channel dark and narrow and the current running through it one-directional, into and not out. Like a throat. Luffy was on the figurehead. He'd been there for most of the 7 hours, which was unusual even for him. Normally he moved around the ship constantly, eating or sleeping or wrestling with Zoro or generally treating the Sunny as his personal environment to rearrange at will. But he'd sat on the figurehead with his arms around his knees and watched the horizon, and after the first hour nobody had gone to talk to him because there was something in his stillness that communicated he was doing something, even if it looked like nothing. He's thinking, Chopper had said to Usopp around hour 3, watching from the deck. Luffy thinks? Usopp had said, and then immediately. No, that was cheap, he absolutely thinks. He's been thinking since Onigashima, Chopper said. Not the same way he used to. Before, when he thought you could kind of see it working, he'd get this squint and his mouth would move. Now it's more like. Chopper searched for the word. Quiet. Like the thinking happens without the effort. Now, as the strait came into view, Luffy stood up on the figurehead. Just stood, looking at the channel, at the weather above it, at the faint shapes that Nami's scope had confirmed were 3 ships sitting in the middle of the throat with nowhere to go. I see them, he said. We're still 40 minutes out at this speed. Nami called from navigation. He nodded. Then, there are people on the walls. Nami looked. Lifted her scope. On the cliff faces of the strait's entrance, on both sides, there were shapes she'd taken for natural formations. They weren't. She recalibrated the scope, moved it along the rock face, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Snipers, she said flatly. On both walls. How many? Zoro asked. Both walls combined. She swept the scope again. 20. Maybe more. I'm only reading the ones who aren't hidden well. So more. Zoro said. So more. She lowered the scope. They let us find the Allied crews. They knew we'd come here. This is the trap, not the weather, not the sniper positions. Us. We're the trap. We're the target. Robin corrected, from where she sat on deck with her arms across her knees. The Allied crews are the bait. We walked into the correct position. Silence on deck. Well, Frankie said from the helm, do we turn around? He asked it knowing the answer. He asked it because it needed to be asked, because the crew operated on explicit acknowledgement of decisions, not unspoken consensus. They all knew the answer. He asked anyway. Luffy turned around from the figurehead. He looked at his crew. He wasn't smiling, not the big one, not yet, but there was something in his expression that was in the same family as a smile, something warm and very settled, like a fire that has found its optimal size. Of course not, he said. Of course not. Frankie agreed, and adjusted their heading directly into the strait. The snipers opened fire when the Sunny entered the channel. Not panicked fire, not warning shots. Coordinated and immediate, coming from both walls simultaneously, which meant a signal system and a command structure, and the kind of preparation that took time and resources and somebody very organized at the top of it. The bolts weren't standard marine issue. They were the heavy-gauge armor-piercing variety that could hold a ship below the waterline at close range, and they came in interlocking patterns designed to eliminate the simple dodge one-side solution. Nami pulled the ship hard to starboard and back to center in a sequence that used the strait's one-directional current against the bolt patterns, creating gaps in the coverage, and Frankie and Usopp were already above deck, Frankie with his arm converted and Usopp with his slingshot drawn, both addressing the walls. Usopp was extraordinary in narrow spaces. He always had been, but something in the 2 years of training had refined the extraordinary into something clinical, the ability to read 3 simultaneous trajectories and resolve them into a single shot sequence that addressed all 3. He was working through the right wall with controlled bursts, not trying to clear it but trying to disrupt the timing of the coordination, gaps in the rhythm being more valuable right now than confirmed eliminations. Frankie was less subtle and didn't need to be 200 meters of stone wall. His range was sufficient and his accuracy at that range had been upgraded twice since the last time he needed it here. He worked the left wall with the efficiency of a man who has made peace with the physics of his situation. They're not stopping, he called. They won't stop, Robin said. She'd created arm eyes across both walls, dozens of them, mapping positions in real time. There are 47 total. The ones we're targeting are the outer layer. The hidden ones are inside the rock itself. There are carved positions. This was prepared specifically for this channel. How long? Nami said. They have resupply capacity in the positions, Robin said. They're not planning to run out. So we can outshoot them, Usopp said, in the voice of a man making a professional assessment rather than expressing despair. Not in time, Robin said. The weather was moving faster than predicted. The cloud wall was close enough now that the leading edge of the wind was reaching them, lifting spray off the water and driving it sideways, and the light in the channel had taken on the specific dimness of pre-storm afternoon, everything slightly wrong-colored. The Allied ships in the middle of the strait were visible now, 3 of them, anchored and unable to maneuver, their crews visible on deck watching the Sunny come in. Even at this distance Luffy could recognize the shapes of ships he'd sailed alongside. He had been standing at the bow through all of this, not moving, which had been alarming enough that Sanji had checked on him twice and confirmed he was alive and choosing to stand there. Now he moved. He stepped off the bow. Not into the water. Onto the water. His feet hit the surface and the gear second was already cycling through his legs, the heat and pressure of it pushing through his rubber soles and creating enough surface tension to stand on, a trick he'd figured out in the last 7 hours on the figurehead and had not told anyone about because explaining it would have taken longer than doing it. He walked across the water toward the cliff wall. The snipers redirected. Of course they did. Luffy walking across water toward them was a problem that superseded the ongoing ship engagement by several orders of magnitude, and the coordinated fire that swiveled toward him was dense and immediate and well aimed. He let it hit him. Not because he was showing off, though it looked like it. Because rubber. Because the bolts struck and deflected, and the ones that didn't deflect immediately were caught and thrown back with the automatic response of a body whose baseline was now all of Gear 4's defensive density without the visible inflation. And it was faster than it had ever been because there was no switching, no transition cost, just the same body being simultaneously what it needed to be. He reached the cliff wall. Put one hand on it. Gear 3rd. One finger. Just one, inflated to the size of a grown man's torso, pressed flat against the rock face, and then the Gear 2nd speed behind the push, and the section of cliff face that came away took 17 sniper positions with it. He looked at the damage. Considered the remaining positions across both walls. "Robin," he called across the water. 22 remaining," she called back from the ship. He looked at the other wall. It was 150 meters away across the channel. He stretched his arm across. It cleared the gap easily. He grabbed a protruding section of rock, aimed his feet at the near wall, and slingshot himself across. It took 4 passes. Back and forth across the channel, using the walls themselves as the instrument, each pass taking out positions that the snipers hadn't been able to evacuate fast enough because none of them had designed their defensive scenario around a person bouncing between 2 cliff faces like a ball between paddles. On the 3rd pass he hit Gear 4th bound man briefly, just long enough to coat the rock faces he was clearing with hardened armament, the black gloss of it spreading through the stone and letting him hit harder without destroying the walls entirely, because destroying the walls would close the channel and that was worse. On the 4th pass he stopped. Perched on the left wall, one hand in the rock, looking down. In the channel below, a ship had appeared from somewhere, not the Sunny, not the Allied ships. A 4th vessel, smaller, faster, the kind of fast that wasn't built for cargo, that had pulled in from behind the weather front where it had been waiting and positioned itself between the Sunny and the Allied ships with its broadside toward both. It was flying no flag. On its deck stood a man. Crane. He looked up at Luffy on the cliff face with the expression of someone looking at a problem they have spent considerable time preparing for. In his right hand was something long and thin that wasn't a sword but wasn't not a sword, a weapon that occupied the space between categories with the specific intent of being difficult to anticipate. Luffy dropped from the wall. He fell the 100 meters to the water's surface and hit it with enough controlled force to create a shockwave in the channel, the water erupting outward in a ring that hit both cliff faces and the hulls of every ship in the strait simultaneously, rocking them, and he landed on the water and straightened and looked at Crane across 40 meters of churned ocean. "You're the fighter," Luffy said. "Yes," Crane said. "Why?" Crane tilted his head fractionally. "Why am I a fighter? Why are you doing this?" Luffy said. "Not you specifically. The people you work for. Why come after my friends instead of just coming after me?" Crane considered this the way he considered everything, quickly, with the economy of thought that came from having had the same fundamental conversation many times before. "Because coming after you directly is inefficient," he said. "You're harder to damage than anything in the physical world. So hurt people around me instead." "Leverage," Crane said. He wasn't apologizing for it or defending it, just naming it. "It works. Does it?" Luffy looked at him. "Is that what happened with the others? The other Joy Boys?" Something moved in Crane's face. Fast, gone before it settled. "Yes," he said. "How'd that work out?" A pause. "They're dead." Luffy nodded slowly. "So the leverage worked?" "Yes." "And they were trying to protect people too?" "Yes." Luffy stood on the water. The wind from the approaching storm was picking up, moving through the channel with force now, and it caught the straw hat's brim and he put one hand up to hold it. "The difference," he said, "is that protecting people doesn't make me desperate. It makes me happy." Crane moved. He was fast, genuinely fast in the way that people who have refined a single skill beyond the point of normal human achievement are fast, the weapon in his hand moving through a trajectory that wouldn't have been visible to most people and was barely visible to Luffy, which meant it was approximately the fastest non-devil fruit thing Luffy had faced since Katakuri. Luffy didn't dodge. He flowed. It was a different quality of movement than he'd used before on Onigashima. Before, dodging had involved a decision, assess the trajectory, calculate the response, execute. Now there was no decision because the integration meant his body was always already in the optimal state for whatever was happening. The weapon went through the space where Luffy had been, because Luffy was a centimeter to the left of where he'd been, effortlessly, inevitably, the way water moves around a stone. Crane's second attack was different. He'd read the first movement and adjusted in real time, the second strike angling to account for the leftward shift, and it was the kind of intelligent combat adjustment that had killed people who were faster than Crane because speed wasn't enough against someone who was also smart. Luffy let it hit him. His left shoulder, armament-coated, the black gloss of hardened hockey covering the impact point, and the weapon hit and rang off like a bell being struck, and Luffy used the impact to spin into a counter-strike. Gear second in the striking arm, the heat visible as faint steam at his shoulder, the velocity enough that the punch he threw displaced the air around it. Crane bent backward under it. Physically bent, spine arcing, the weapon sweeping upward in a defensive diagonal that deflected enough of the strike to avoid contact. Barely. The edge of Luffy's fist passed close enough to Crane's chin that it displaced the air there too, a sound like a very short sentence being erased. He came back upright. Looked at Luffy. For the first time since the strait, something changed in his expression. Not fear. Crane had systematically removed fear from his responses years ago because fear introduced hesitation and hesitation was fatal. What changed was the very precise calibration of his threat assessment. He was adjusting it upward. "You've fought people like me before," Crane said. Moving. Not retreating, repositioning. His feet on his ship's deck, finding the balance point. "What kind of people?" Luffy asked, moving too, the water barely indenting under his feet. "People who study their opponents," Crane said. "Who read every movement as data and respond to the data." "Yeah," Luffy said. "Katakuri did that." Crane knew the name. He filed the comparison. "And? He was incredible," Luffy said, with genuine appreciation. "Really strong. Could see the future and everything." He rolled his neck. "But he was fighting the version of me that existed then. I'm not that version anymore." Crane came at him again. 3 attacks, this time, not sequential but simultaneous, the weapon splitting into configurations that it hadn't appeared capable of when it looked like a single thing, because it hadn't been a single thing, and the 3 independent trajectories came at Luffy from angles that addressed his left, right, and center simultaneously. Luffy went up. Not a jump, the gear second in his legs kicked to a heat level that turned his footsteps on the water into steam jets, and he launched himself vertically, above the 3 strikes, high enough that the weapon arcs completed their paths below him, and at the top of the arc he pulled his arm back with gear third inflation, taking it to a size that in bound man form would have been enormous but in this form was contained, precise. The size not spread through his whole body but focused in the single limb. The punch came down. Not at Crane. At the ship. The deck between them, specifically, because Luffy wasn't trying to end the fight in one shot and because he wanted to see what Crane did when the ground changed underneath him. The deck exploded. The ship cracked down its center spine with a sound like a tree being split, and the 2 halves began separating in the channel, and Crane was in the air before the impact fully resolved, because of course he was. The same economy of motion that made everything he did look like it had been decided before it was necessary. He landed on the left cliff wall. Luffy landed on the water. They looked at each other across the channel. The storm was very close now, the wind was loud and the light was almost gone, and the first fat drops of rain were hitting the water around them, each one producing a small impact circle that spread and overlapped. "You're not trying to kill me," Crane said. "Not yet," Luffy said. "I want to know who sent you." "You already know who sent me. I want to know why." He looked up at Crane on the wall. "The real why. Not the message you delivered in the harbor." Crane was quiet for a moment. Rain was coming down properly now, running down the cliff face, plastering his copper hair to his forehead. He looked at Luffy standing on the water below him, and whatever calculation was happening behind his ice-colored eyes was the most complex one of the conversation. "They're afraid," he said. "That's always the real why." "Afraid of what?" "Of what you represent," Crane said. "Freedom that can't be contained is the most destabilizing force in any system. They've built the world around containment. You're—" he stopped, chose the word precisely. "Incompatible. So they'd rather I was dead. They'd rather you were manageable," Crane said. "Dead is a last option because dead creates martyrs." He looked down the channel at the Allied ships. "Manageable means surrounded by enough vulnerability that you make choices they can predict." Luffy processed this. "And you? You think that's right?" Long pause. "Rain. I think it's effective," Crane said. "That's not the same thing." Crane looked at him. Really looked, in a way he hadn't done since the conversation started, and something in the look was the thing that people who have buried something deep carry in their eyes when something external digs close to where the burial is. "No," he said. "It's not." Luffy moved. He covered the distance to the wall in 2 steps on water and a gear second leap, and he was at wall height in an instant, and the punch he threw wasn't the gentle, precision thing he'd been using. This was full. This was gear second and gear third and the armament density of gear fourth all running at once through a single arm, the arm inflated and steam-wreathed and black with hockey and moving at a speed that left a line of compressed air behind it. Gear second. Gear third. Gear fourth snakeman. Not sequentially. All 3. The arm moved and then bent, the snakeman trajectory reversal kicking in mid-flight, changing the angle at the last moment so that the strike came in from a direction that the initial trajectory hadn't predicted, and it hit Crane in the chest with every gram of force the integration could produce. He went through the wall. Into it, through it, out the other side, the stone parting around him and closing again in his wake like water, and he hit the open sea on the other side of the straight wall, and the impact produced the geyser that the incoming storm swallowed before it could complete itself. Luffy stood in the hole in the wall. He waited. 30 seconds. Rain. Wind. The channel behind him with the Allies and the Sunny and his crew working to get everyone moving before the storm closed in. Crane surfaced. Not quickly. Not with the controlled precision of before. He came up at an angle, one arm working, the other held at his side in a way that suggested it had its own opinions about being used right now. He found a piece of debris from his split ship and held it, and caught his breath. He looked up at the hole in the wall where Luffy stood. "You held back," he said. "Yeah," Luffy said. "Why?" Luffy crouched in the hole, arms on his knees, rain falling past him. "Because you're not the real problem," he said. "You're just the first move." He looked at Crane in the water. "Who is Voss?" Crane stilled. "You heard the name. Robin has ears everywhere." He tilted his head. "Who is she?" For a long moment Crane floated in the water and the rain and the storm noise and looked at the boy crouching in the hole in the cliff. The look lasted long enough that it stopped being tactical and started being something else. The look of a person arriving at a decision they've been standing in front of for a long time. "She was a pirate," Crane said. "The best captain I ever served under. Before she stopped. And now? Now she believes what she's doing is the most important thing anyone can do." He paused. "She might be right. She's wrong," Luffy said. Simply. Without heat. Crane looked at him. "You know that with certainty?" "Yeah," Luffy said. "Because caging people to protect them is just a cage with better PR." Crane was quiet for a long time. Then he laughed. It was a surprised sound, short and genuine, the laugh of a person who heard something true come from an unexpected direction. He pressed his free hand to his cracked ribs and laughed, and then he stopped and looked at Luffy again with those ice-silver eyes that had gone slightly warmer in the last 30 seconds. "She'll want to meet you," he said. "I'll be ready," Luffy said. He dropped from the hole back into the channel and walked across the water toward the Sunny. Behind him, the storm closed over the exit he'd made in the wall, the rain hammering down into the sea, indifferent and total. On the Sunny's deck, the crew had been working through the storm preparation with the focused efficiency of people who had not been watching the fight. They'd been watching it, all of them, every available eye on Luffy, while their hands did the rigging and navigation and medical work that the situation required, because this was how the crew operated. They held the world up while their captain held the front. And the holding went in both directions. Zoro had been watching from the railing the whole time. He hadn't said anything. He had watched with the total attention of his best self, the version that did not compete and did not compare, and simply looked at things clearly. Now, as Luffy stepped back onto the Sunny from the water, Zoro turned from the railing and went back to helping Frankie secure the rigging. "Well?" Nami said, meeting Luffy at the bow. "We need to talk to someone named Voss," he said. "The CP0 person behind this?" "Yeah." He looked back at the channel. The Allied ships were moving now. Nami and Robin between them had coordinated the message using Robin's arms extended across the channel, and the ships were making for the exit before the storm fully closed it, their captains having received enough of the situation's outline to know that staying was worse than going. "She was a pirate." "Was?" Nami said. "Yeah." He looked thoughtful. "She lost people." Nami was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Allied ships moving through the exit. "And that turned her into this." "Something did." He turned from the railing. "She's not wrong about everything. She just drew the wrong line." He was already moving toward the center of the ship, toward the main deck where the crew was in motion and where the storm was beginning its formal arrival, the rain coming down in earnest now, the wind at a level that required everyone to be useful. "What line?" Nami called after him. He looked back. Rain on his face. The straw hat's brim turning down under the water weight. The gold had left his eyes back in the channel, but the thing underneath the gold was still there, the settled, clear, unafraid thing that had been there since Onigashima. "The line between protecting people and controlling them," he said. "She crossed it going one direction. I won't." Then he went to help with the rigging because there was a storm and a ship and 11, 12 people whose lives were in direct relationship to how well the rigging held, and that was what was in front of him right now, and Luffy had always been, above everything, a person who dealt with what was in front of him. The storm hit properly 10 minutes later. It was a serious storm. Not a calm belt anomaly or a devil weather special, just a legitimate new world tempest with the weight and commitment of a natural system that had been building for days over warm water. The channel amplified it, the walls funneling the wind into a sound like the ocean arguing with itself. The Thousand Sunny rode it. Not elegantly, elegantly was for calm weather. But the ship held its integrity through the worst of it with the stubborn specificity of a vessel that had been built to be in exactly these conditions and knew it. Frankie was everywhere at once, checking connections and reinforcing stress points and talking to the ship the entire time in a continuous monologue that nobody was listening to except the ship. Usopp and Chopper handled the lines. Yamato handled the anchor deployment when they found the calm pocket that Nami had predicted would be halfway through the storm system, which arrived at the precise time Nami said it would because Nami's relationship with weather patterns was the most reliable ongoing relationship any of them had ever witnessed. In the calm pocket, rocking gently, rain still coming but light and direct rather than horizontal, the Sunny and the 3 Allied ships sat together in a temporary circle. The Allied captains came aboard, wet and shaken and in 2 cases mildly injured but whole. The conversations that followed were the practical kind, the kind that had to happen before the emotional kind could, the logistics of routing and heading and the storm's expected end. Then the emotional kind. One captain, a man named Decker whose crew had been with the Straw Hat Alliance since Wano, stood on the Sunny's deck and looked at Luffy and said, in a flat voice that had a slight shake in it he wasn't bothering to hide. "You came." "Obviously," Luffy said. "We didn't ask, didn't have to," Luffy said. Decker looked at him for a moment. He was older than Luffy by about 15 years, a broad-shouldered man with a beard that had been through a lot, and he looked at Luffy with the specific expression of someone recalibrating a fundamental assumption. How did you even know we were there? Someone told us, Luffy said. They thought it would complicate things. Did it? No, Luffy said. Later that night, after the storm had concluded its business and moved on and the Allied ships had gone their separate ways with courses that avoided known CP0 traffic routes, Luffy sat on the Sunny's deck in the clean air that storms left behind, the sky washed to an extraordinary clarity, stars everywhere. Sanji brought food without being asked. He always brought food without being asked. It was one of his most reliable properties. He sat down across from Luffy and lit his cigarette finally, the one that had been in his mouth since Mirela, and exhaled. That man, Sanji said. Crane. He was serious. Very, Luffy said. Could have been worse. He flicked ash. You went easy on him. I wasn't going easy, Luffy said. I just didn't need to hit harder than that. Sanji looked at him. There's a difference? Before Onigashima there wasn't, Luffy said. He ate. Chewed. Now I can calibrate. I know how much I'm using and I know how much I'm not using, and I can choose. He looked at the food with the appreciation of a person who eats well but eats fast and is making an effort to be present with the quality. Sanji, this is really good. Obviously, Sanji said. He smoked for a moment. What's coming next? After Voss. Luffy thought about this. Not in the searching way, the way of someone who didn't know. In the way of someone checking whether the answer they already had was complete. The world changes, he said. That's what they're afraid of. But it's going to change anyway. He looked at the stars. We just have to keep going until it does. That's it, Sanji said. What else would there be? Sanji looked at the stars too. Smoked. Fair enough, he said. Somewhere below deck, Robin was writing in the journal she kept. Not the academic one with the notes on poneglyphs and historical references, a different one, smaller, that nobody had ever asked her about. She wrote in a very small hand that was a habit from years of writing things she couldn't afford to have seen, and what she wrote was not a record of events but something closer to thinking on paper. He told Crane that protecting people makes him happy, not desperate, she wrote. And the strange thing is that he wasn't performing it. He was just reporting a fact. She paused. The pen moved again. I used to think the people who could love freely were the ones who hadn't lost enough yet. That eventually, if you lost enough, the free loving stopped and you were left with only the careful kind. The kind that rations itself. I have been careful for 20 years. I think I was wrong about the math. She closed the journal. The Sunny moved through the clean night toward whatever came next, and the ocean was wide and starlit, and said nothing, which was fine because the ocean was always there and always honest and the people on the ship already knew what they needed to know. Chapter 5. The last honest thing. Voss chose the meeting place herself, which told Robin everything. It was an island called Sanctum, not its real name, its operational name, the kind of name that showed up in classified documents, and nowhere else. The real name, on the old charts that Robin had spread across the Sunny's table the morning after the storm, was Caliva, a small island in a stretch of ocean that the New World treated as transition space, not quite the chaos of the deep routes, and not quite the relative predictability of the closer islands. The kind of place that existed in the gaps. The island had one settlement, coastal, modest. A church that had been something else before it was a church, and would likely be something else again after. A harbor that could hold 6 ships comfortably, and had 6 ships in it, none of them flying colors. Voss had sent the coordinates through Crane. Not through intermediaries, not encoded, a clean, direct message delivered to the Sunny while they were still riding the post-storm current, dropped onto the deck by a den Mushi that Nami had not heard approach and that was gone before she could locate the transmitting vessel. The message read, alone. You and whoever you choose. I'll match the number. 2 days. Luffy had read it and said okay, and gone back to eating breakfast. The 2 days were the problem. Not operationally. Nami had the route plotted inside an hour, and it was clean sailing, nothing interesting between the Sunny's current position and Calavis coordinates. The 2 days were a problem in the specific way that waiting before a significant event is always a problem, which is that it gave everyone on the ship enough time to think. Zoro trained until Chopper threatened to sedate him, at which point he moved to a different part of the ship and trained there. His chest wound had been reclassified from potentially life-threatening if exacerbated to serious and requiring respect to healing at a pace that Chopper described as medically implausible and personally offensive. And Zoro was treating the reclassification as permission to resume full activity, which was not quite what Chopper had meant but was approximately what everyone had expected. Nami charted. When she finished charting, she recharted, refining and refining until the margins of the map were covered in notation. Then she rolled it up and made tea and stood at the stern and looked at the water and thought about the kind of people who had been pirates once and chosen to stop, and what that choice carved out of a person over time. Usopp built things. He always built things when he was processing something, new ammunition types, contraptions that were theoretically useful and practically eccentric, modifications to existing equipment that his hands understood before his mind did. He built for most of the first day, and on the morning of the second day he came and sat next to Luffy and said nothing for a while, and then said, "She's not stupid." "No," Luffy agreed. "So she's got something planned for the meeting that isn't just talking." "Probably. And you're going anyway." "Yeah." Usopp picked at the wood grain of the deck. "Because that's what you do. Because talking is how you find out what someone actually wants," Luffy said. "And I want to know what she actually wants." "You already know what she wants. Robin told us what she's trying to do," Luffy said. "That's not the same as what she wants." Usopp looked at him. He had known Luffy long enough that he had a good catalog of Luffy's versions of wisdom, the accidental kind, the instinctive kind, the very occasional kind that sounded thought through but probably wasn't and arrived at the right place anyway. This one he couldn't immediately classify. "When did you get like this?" Usopp said. "Like what?" "Like." He gestured vaguely at all of Luffy. "This." Luffy looked at him. Grinned. "I've always been like this." "You have not always been like this." "Maybe I've been like this since the beginning and you just noticed." Usopp sat with that for a moment. "That's either very profound or completely wrong." "Yeah," Luffy agreed, and went back to looking at the ocean. Robin spent the 2 days doing 2 things alternately, reading and thinking about Crane's line. "She was a pirate. The best captain I ever served under." Before she stopped. The grief in that sentence was architectural. It had been built into the structure of the words, not displayed on their surface, and Robin recognized that kind of grief because she had built similar architecture around her own. The kind that doesn't come out as sadness but as systems. As control. As the need to make the world less random, more manageable, because randomness had already taken everything once, and the only response that felt survivable was to make oneself the one who decided what happened next. She understood Voss. That was the thing she turned over and over during those 2 days. She understood Voss in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence gathering and everything to do with having been, for most of her life, the same kind of person. Someone who had been so catastrophically hurt by freedom's cost, her freedom, O'Hara's freedom, the freedom to pursue truth against the world's loudest no, that she had spent 2 decades not having it, moving through the world sealed and careful and survivable. And then Luffy had walked into her life and dismantled that with the casual, cheerful destructiveness of a person who didn't know the word for sealed. She hadn't asked to be saved. She hadn't asked for the hand extended from a burning ship. She hadn't asked for any of it. It had just happened, the way light happens when you open a door, not because the light chose you but because that's what light does. She wondered if Voss had ever had a hand extended and missed it. Or refused it. She wondered which was worse. Caliva appeared on the morning of the second day as a low green shape on a blue horizon, unremarkable in profile, the kind of island that the sea produced in quantity, and that contained, most of the time, nothing in particular. The harbor's ships were visible before the harbor itself, the mast tops above the island's slight ridge. Luffy came to the bow when the island appeared. He stood there in his red vest and the remains of his recent outfit, which had been repaired twice in the last week by Robin's patient hands and still looked like it had opinions about its own structural integrity. The straw hat. Always the straw hat. "Who are you bringing?" Nami asked behind him. He'd thought about this. "Zoro." "Robin." "Not me?" she said. Her tone was neutral, which meant she was watching to see how he'd answer. "I need you on the ship," he said. "If this goes wrong, you and Usopp and Frankie get everyone out." She was quiet. He could feel her thinking. "You think it'll go wrong?" "I think she's smart," he said. "So I'm accounting for wrong." He looked back at her over his shoulder. "Which means I need the ship run by the person I trust most to handle it." She held his eyes for a moment, this woman who had known him since a fishing village and a tangerine grove and a deal that had cost her everything and got her everything back, and she said nothing, just nodded, once, and went to the navigation room. They took a small boat in. Luffy, Zoro, Robin. The water between the Sunny and the harbor was glassy in the morning, the kind of flat that felt deliberate, and the small boats, oars moved through it quietly. Voss was waiting at the harbor's end. She was taller than any of them had expected from Crane's description, which was strange because Crane hadn't described her physically. She was simply tall in the way that communicated authority before anything else did, and she stood at the harbor wall with her arms loose at her sides and looked at the approaching boat with an expression that had been worked on. Not fake. Worked on. The difference between constructed and fabricated, between a face that has been made to communicate something and a face that is hiding something, was a distinction Robin had spent her life reading, and she read it now. Voss was presenting calm because calm was the correct register for this conversation, not because she felt it. 3 of her people stood behind her. Robin catalogued them in 3 seconds. 2 were fighters, quality ones, the kind of quality that meant training rather than talent. The 3rd was the cipher agent class of person, hands folded, watching with the patient data-gathering focus of someone whose job was memory. They reached the dock. Luffy stepped off the boat first. He and Voss looked at each other across about 10 feet of weathered dockwood, and the look lasted long enough to be something other than an assessment. She was looking at the white hair, or the hair that had been white, now back to black, but the shape of him that the white hair had briefly been. She was looking at the age of him, 19 years, in a face that had no armor on it, nothing withheld, nothing performed. Just looking. He was looking at her eyes. They were dark and sharp, and the thing behind them was complex, not evil, not cold, but layered in a way that belonged to a person who had made many decisions and lived inside all their consequences simultaneously. He'd seen eyes like that once before. In the mirror, the morning after Marineford. The morning after Ace. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "You're older than Crane made you sound," he said. Her mouth moved. Almost a smile. "Not quite. He has a soft spot for me." "I know," Luffy said. "He told me you were the best captain he ever served under." Something in Voss shifted. Not dramatically, she was too composed for drama, but the shift was visible to anyone paying attention, and Robin was paying attention to everything. "He said that." "Yeah." Luffy looked around at the harbor. The island. The church on the hill above the settlement, that had been something else before. "Nice place. I've had worse offices," she said. "Can we talk inside?" he said. "Or is this the kind of conversation that needs to happen where someone can see the exits?" She looked at him for a beat. "Inside," she said, and turned toward the church. It was dim inside and smelled of old wood and something that might have been incense, or might have been the ocean getting in through the gaps, and the pews had been pushed to the walls to create a central space with a table and chairs that looked like they'd been brought in recently and deliberately. Lanterns. No windows except the high ones that let in a diffuse gray light. Voss sat on one side of the table. Luffy sat on the other. Zoro stood at the door because that was where Zoro stood. Robin took a pew, sat, opened nothing, and became the most attentive piece of furniture in the room. Voss's 3 people arranged themselves at equivalent distances. The cipher agent began the memory work immediately. You know why you're here, Voss said. Because you want to understand me, Luffy said. Not because you want to deal. You could have sent terms through Crane. You wanted to see me. She didn't confirm or deny it. Tell me what you want, she said. Ultimately. Not King of the Pirates, that's a title. What does the title mean to you? Luffy leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the old wood of it. Freedom, he said. Everyone says freedom. Not the same freedom, he said. He looked at her. Mine isn't the freedom to do whatever I want. It's not about me. It's… He stopped. He was working towards something, and the working was visible, the honest effort of a person who has the answer in a form that isn't quite words yet. When I was a kid, there was a guy. He sat in my village and he drank sake and he laughed and he told stories, and when he left, everyone in the village felt like the horizon had gotten bigger. Like there was more world than there had been before. He paused. That's what I want. Not for me. For everyone. Voss was very still. A wider horizon, she said. Yeah. And you think you're the person to make that happen? I think I'm one of the people, he said. My crew is the people. The people we meet are the people. He shrugged. I'm just the one at the front. She looked at him for a long time. The cipher agent was writing. Robin was not. Robin was watching Voss. I had a crew, Voss said. I know. You don't know, she said, with the first real edge of the conversation, not anger but precision, the precision of someone correcting a factual error before it calculates wrong. You know that I had a crew. You don't know what it was. Tell me, he said. She hadn't planned to. The conversation had a structure she'd designed, the Socratic pressure points, the logical demonstration, the moment at which any reasonable person would concede that unlimited freedom was a liability, not a gift. She had run it against Crane as a test when she first recruited him, and it had worked. It had worked on 3 subsequent subjects who were considerably more resistant than Crane. She had not planned to tell him anything personal. Personal was a resource you spent when nothing else would work. She spent it now, and she wasn't sure why. 11 people, she said. My crew. We sailed for 4 years in the North Blue and made it to the Grand Line on the back of nothing but those 11 people being extraordinary. She looked at the table. Her hands were flat on it. She had good hands, a sailor's hands, the kind that showed work. The freedom we had was real. I want you to know that. I'm not trying to tell you freedom isn't real. I'm telling you it's not free. Nothing's free, Luffy said. The cost of ours was all 11 of them, she said. One by one and then all at once, across 3 years, the world came for us because we were free and it couldn't tolerate it. Not the Marines, worse than the Marines. The things the world government does that don't have names. They target the people around you and they do it slowly, and they do it until there's nobody left and you're free and alone and… She stopped. The room was very quiet. I know, Luffy said. She looked up at him. Don't ace, he said. Just the name. He said it the way you say a name that still has teeth. My brother. They took him and I couldn't. He stopped too. He looked at his hands. I know what it costs. Something moved across Voss's face that her working had not been able to prevent. It was brief and complete, and Robin saw it and Zoro, from the door, saw it, the 2 of them independently registering the same thing, grief recognizing grief, across the table, across every decision that had brought both of them to this room. Then you understand why I'm doing this, Voss said. I understand why you think it works, Luffy said. I don't agree that it does. I have evidence, she said, and now she was back to the structure, the controlled precision of her professional self. The 3 candidates before you, the partial awakenings, They were all destroyed by exactly the mechanism I described. Their freedom cost everyone around them. Containment would have protected those people. Containment would have killed them differently, Luffy said. That's a philosophical distinction. No, he said. It's practical. He leaned forward. You're 11 people. They knew what they were doing, right? They chose to sail with you. They chose the freedom. She was quiet. Did they? He said. Not pressing. Asking. Yes, she said. After a moment. Yes, they chose. So you're taking that choice away from everyone else, to protect them from the consequences of a choice they haven't made yet. He looked at her steadily. That's not protection. That's something else. It's prevention, she said. It's fear, he said. And I get it. I do. I felt it after Marineford. I felt it so bad I didn't want to be captain anymore. Didn't want anyone near me. Didn't want to be responsible for anyone's choice except mine. He paused. But you know what my crew did? She waited. They found me, he said. 2 years later. After I told them to scatter. After I did everything I could to dissolve the thing so there'd be nothing left to target. He shook his head slowly. They found me and they all came back, every single one, because they'd made their choice already and they weren't letting me take it away from them. He looked at Voss. That's the difference between me and you. I let people choose. You stopped. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of something structural being tested. You're 19 years old, Voss said. Her voice was controlled, but the control was doing more work now, the seams visible. You have not lost enough yet. I've lost enough, he said quietly. I just decided the losing wasn't the lesson. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was performing anything. That was the quality of the silence, the specific honesty of two people who have stopped managing the conversation and are just in it. Then Voss stood up. It wasn't a signal. No look at her people, no change in posture beyond the physical act of standing. She stood and she moved away from the table to the far wall of the church, the wall behind where the altar would have been if this had been what it currently looked like, and she stood with her back to the room. I was going to offer you something today, she said. A structure. Something that would make the world government consider you an acceptable presence rather than a threat to be eliminated. Conditional cooperation. Defined boundaries. She paused. I was going to sell it as the rational choice. I know, Luffy said. She turned around. You knew? Robin told me the night before we got here, he said. What the most logical thing for you to offer would be, given what you've built, and what you believe. He glanced at Robin, who was looking at the high windows with an expression of profound neutrality. She's good at that. Voss looked at Robin. Robin looked back, and the look between them was the peculiar silent language of two people who have read each other accurately, and are acknowledging it. She's extraordinary, Voss said. All of them are, Luffy said. He stood up too. I'm not taking the offer. Not because I'm stupid and not because I think I can't be hurt. I know I can be hurt. But because the offer is based on the idea that my freedom is the problem, and it's not. He looked at her across the table. The problem is the cage. The cage has always been the problem. You just ended up on the inside of it, and started thinking it was yours. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Crane. It wasn't a call. It was quieter than a call. An acknowledgement of something she'd already half decided. Crane appeared from the back of the church. He had been there the whole time, in the shadow of the pushed-aside pews, and he walked into the lantern light looking like a man who had been standing very still for a very long time thinking things that had changed in quality as the conversation progressed. You heard it, Voss said. All of it, he said. She looked at him. At the specific way he was standing, looser than normal, the hand at his side not open ready but just open. And? He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that you know something important. And I think, He looked at Luffy. I think he also knows something important. And I think the problem is that you've both built those somethings into weapons. Voss went very still. I fought him, Crane said. In the channel. He held back. I know, she said. He held back specifically, Crane said. Not because he was being merciful in a general sense. Because he'd already decided that what he needed from me wasn't to win. It was the name. He looked at Luffy. My name for your next problem. Which he got. Useful, Luffy said. Yes. Crane turned back to Voss. The three before him, I was a different instrument for a different purpose each time. The purpose was always the same, find the people they love and remove them as an option. He paused. This one doesn't have that weakness. You can't remove his people from the equation because his people are the equation. Taking them doesn't make him desperate. It makes him angry. And angry and integrated is. He searched for the word. Catastrophic. Robin offered from the pew. Yes, Crane said. Voss looked at all of them. She looked at Luffy last, and the look was long and complicated, and the thing behind it was the grief she described, all 11 of them, for years, and the grand line and the cost still sitting in her eyes the way that kind of grief sits, present, always present, not diminished by time but refined by it into something harder and more specific. What do you want from me? She said. Nothing, Luffy said. You started this. I just wanted to talk. That's not. She stopped. I don't want anything from you, he said. I'm not asking you to join us or help us or stop what you're doing because I told you a good argument. He put his hands in his pockets. I just wanted you to know that the thing you're afraid of, freedom costing people their lives, that's real. It's absolutely real. But the answer you built isn't the right answer. Then what is? She said, and the question was more naked than she'd intended. The question of someone who has been running a system they built out of grief for long enough that they've forgotten if there's an alternative. Same thing it always is, Luffy said. Let them choose. Be worth choosing. He shrugged. That's it. She laughed. It came out of her the same way Crane's laugh had come out in the channel, surprised, brief, completely genuine. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth and the laugh ended, but the sound of it hung in the old church air. You're absurd, she said. People tell me that, he said. You're absurd and you're going to get your crew killed. Maybe, he said. They know the risk. She looked at him. Crane is right, she said. You're not like the others. No, Luffy said. That doesn't make you safe, she said. I never said I was safe, he said. I said I was free. Another silence. This one had a different texture, not the testing silence of before, or the grief-adjacent silence of the confessional moments, but something more like the silence after a door has been opened and the first rush of air from outside has come in and hasn't settled yet. Voss looked at Crane. Crane looked at her. Something passed between them in that look that had been building since the channel, since the moment he'd laughed in the open sea. Since the moment he'd said she might be right about his former captain without the certainty he usually brought to his assessments. I need to think, Voss said. Take your time, Luffy said. He pushed his chair in. We'll be on the island for the rest of the day. We're leaving tomorrow morning. And if I come at you before morning? She said. Not a threat. A genuine question about the parameters. Then we'll fight, he said, with total equanimity. And I'll win. But I don't think you'll do that. She looked at him. Why not? He looked back with those dark eyes, the ones that had been gold, the ones that were something in between gold and dark when the light was right. Because you talk to me, he said. People who are only going to fight don't talk first. He walked to the door. Zoro stepped aside without being asked. Robin stood and followed with the seamless quiet she brought to all her movements. At the door Luffy paused. He didn't turn around. I'm sorry about your crew, he said. The church was very quiet. I'm sorry about your brother, Voss said. He nodded once. Went out into the gray island light. Zoro and Robin followed. The door settled behind them on its old hinges with a sound like a sentence completing. Inside, Voss stood at the table and Crane stood in the lantern light, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "He's right," Crane said. "Don't," she said. "About the choice," Crane said. "He's right about the choice. My choice, specifically." He looked at his hands. "The open one. The uncommitted one. I chose to stay after the channel. I chose to listen from the pews. I'm choosing what I'm choosing right now." He looked up at her. "That's not him doing something to me. That's mine." She looked at him. The grief was there. The system she'd built from it was there. And also, sitting in the room with both of them now, the particular quality of a crack that has appeared in a wall that was built as a permanent structure and must now be understood differently. "You want to go with him?" she said. "I want to stop," he said. "Not the same thing." He paused. "Maybe the same thing. I haven't decided." She looked out the high window. Gray light. The harbor. The 6 ships. "The world government will send someone else," she said. "Yes," he said. "They will. Someone worse. Probably." He paused. "You know what he'll do when they do?" She closed her eyes. Behind them, briefly, were 11 faces. 4 years. The grand line. The cost. She held them there, those 11 faces, and she looked at them clearly for the first time in a long time without the architecture of the system filtering the view. They had chosen. Every one of them, every decision, every mile of sea, chosen. She had been so busy grieving the cost that she had not been honoring the choice. She opened her eyes. "Go," she said. Not to Crane. To the harbor. To the 6 ships. To the long shape of the decision she was still inside, still working through, that was going to take considerably longer than one conversation to resolve. "I need to think." He left her in the church. On the dock outside, afternoon was coming in over the island with the particular golden quality that follows gray mornings when the clouds decide to give way, and Luffy was sitting on a bollard eating something he'd found from somewhere, and Zoro was sitting against the harbor wall with his eyes closed and one hand on his swords and his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man who is not asleep but is very still. Robin was looking at the water. Crane walked out and stopped on the dock. He looked at Luffy. Luffy looked at him. "Walk?" Crane said. Luffy hopped off the bollard. They walked along the harbor wall in the new afternoon light, 2 people with essentially nothing in common except that they had both been in a channel in a storm and told each other true things, and Crane said, after a while, "She's going to come back around. Not all the way. But part way." "I know," Luffy said. "How?" "Because she's not stupid," Luffy said. "And stupid is the only reason people don't, eventually." Crane looked at the water. At the sunny in the harbor, green and gold and built like something that loved the sea. At the crew visible on deck, moving with the ordinary choreography of people who were home. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "The Joy Boy thing," Crane said. "Kaido called you that. The world government is terrified of it. Robin knows what it means academically." He paused. "What does it mean to you?" Luffy walked for a moment. Just walked on the harbor wall, with the afternoon light and the sound of the sea. "Nothing," he said. Crane looked at him. "It's a name for something that existed before me," Luffy said. "A person who tried and didn't make it all the way. And then other people who tried after him." He looked at the horizon. "I'm not any of them. I'm just me. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to do because I want to, because it's right, because my friends are with me." He glanced at Crane. "Joy Boy is what other people need to call it. I don't need a name for it." Crane was quiet for a long time. "That," he said finally, "is either the most or least profound thing I've ever heard." "Yeah," Luffy said. "Usopp said something like that." Crane almost smiled. "He sounds like a reasonable person. He's terrified of everything and brave anyway, Luffy said. "He's the most reasonable person I know." They walked back to where Zoro and Robin were waiting, and the afternoon finished arriving properly, gold and generous and indifferent to the calculations of powerful people. On the sunny, visible through the harbor, Nami's orange hair caught the light at the bow where she stood watching. Sanji was cooking. The smell of it reached the dock. Tomorrow they would leave for Elbaf. Tonight the island was quiet and the church on the hill held a woman who was in the long, difficult process of reconsidering the most important decision of her life, and on the harbor wall a man who had killed 3 Joy Boy candidates stood beside the 4th and let the afternoon be the afternoon. Luffy put his hands behind his head. "You know what the best thing about tomorrow is?" he said. Crane looked at him. "What?" "I have no idea what's going to happen," Luffy said, with absolute joy. Crane looked at the horizon. At the wide, indifferent, honest sea. He understood, he thought, why people followed this person. Chapter 6. Free people make the horizon. The Thousand Sunny left Caliva on a morning that had decided to be extraordinary about it. The kind of morning that the New World produced occasionally, as if the ocean felt the need to remind everyone why they came here in the first place. The light coming in at a low angle that turned the water into hammered copper, the wind sitting at exactly the speed that filled the sails without strain, the sky the particular blue that had no name in any language because no language had been invented in conditions modest enough to need one. Crane was on the dock when they left. He stood at the harbor wall and watched the Sunny pull out with his hands in his pockets and his copper hair moving in the morning wind, and Luffy waved at him from the figurehead, the whole body wave, the one that didn't require any response to feel complete, and Crane lifted one hand in return. Not a wave exactly. An acknowledgement. Voss was not on the dock. Luffy had not expected her to be. He knocked on the church door that morning before dawn and she hadn't answered, and he'd stood there for a moment in the dark outside it and said, to the door, to the island, to whoever was listening, "The offer's open. Whenever." Then he'd gone back to the ship and eaten the enormous breakfast Sanji had prepared and helped cast off the lines. By the time Caliva was a shape on the horizon, Nami had the charts out and the course to Elbaf plotted with the aggressive precision of a woman who had been sitting on a destination for too long. 4 days, she said to the assembled crew at the main table. Good weather, following current, no detours. She looked pointedly around the table. No. Detours. What counts as a detour? Luffy asked. Anything that isn't the direct route to Elbaf. What if something interesting? No, Nami said. But, Luffy. He subsided. Ate a drumstick of something Sanji had left on the table. Yamato had her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, looking at the chart with the focused attention she gave to everything navigation related. What do we know about Elbaf's current political situation? She asked. My father had a complicated history with the giants. Most people have a complicated history with the giants, Usopp said. He was trying to sound casual. He was not succeeding at sounding casual. He had been not succeeding at sounding casual about Elbaf since it was first mentioned. Usopp, Robin said. The giants of Elbaf will know you. Know of me, Usopp corrected. Know you, Robin said. Dory and Broggy have spoken about you to their island. Stories travel in giant communities more completely than almost anywhere else. You are not an unknown quantity on Elbaf. Usopp looked at her. Then at Luffy. Then at the table. That's either very good or the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. Very good, Luffy said. He said the same thing about Enies Lobby, Usopp told Chopper. That turned out fine, Chopper said. We blew up the judicial island of the world government. Fine, Chopper maintained. The 4 days were good days. Not the reflective, processing kind of good that the days at sea before Caliva had been, but the forward-moving kind, the kind that felt like acceleration, the crew settling into the rhythms of open ocean travel with the ease of people who were finally doing the thing they were built to do after too long in one place. Luffy trained every morning in the below-deck space and every afternoon on the main deck with no particular attempt at discretion, which meant the crew watched him work through his integration with the ambient attention of people who have something important playing in the background of whatever else they're doing. The precision work continued. He was getting finer and finer with it, the ability to run different gear systems through different parts of his body simultaneously with increasing independence. He could hold third in his left arm and second in his legs and the ambient hockey density of fourth across his torso all at the same time, each separate, each deliberate. On the third day he was on the main deck working through some variation of this, and Zoro was sitting nearby doing his weights, and Sanji came up from the kitchen for air, and the three of them were in the same space in the late afternoon light, and nobody said anything, and the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that only exists between people who don't need the space filled. Then Zoro said, not looking up from his weights, "They're going to send something bigger than Crane." "Yep," Luffy said. "After Elbaf, probably. Once they confirm you've found another poneglyph." "Probably." Sanji blew smoke at the sky. "Admiral class, you think?" "Bigger," Zoro said. "Crane was a test. They needed to know what they were actually dealing with." He set down one weight and picked up another. "Now they know." "Good," Luffy said. Both Zoro and Sanji looked at him. "Let them send everything," Luffy said. He wasn't performing it. His voice was level and warm and entirely serious. "I want them to understand as fast as possible that this is happening. The longer they think they can stop it, the more people get hurt trying." He looked at his hands. "So yeah? Send everything. The faster we get through everything, the faster we get to the end." Zoro looked at him for a long moment. "You know what the end looks like?" "One Piece," Luffy said. "The king of the pirates. A world where the sea is actually free." He shrugged. "I know what it feels like. I'll know what it looks like when I see it." Zoro picked up the weight again. "Good enough," he said. Sanji flicked his cigarette over the railing and went back down to the kitchen, because there was dinner to make and this conversation had reached its natural end, and also because if he stayed longer he was going to say something sincere and he had a reputation to maintain. Elbaf appeared on the fourth morning not as a shape on a horizon but as a sound. They heard it before they saw it, a low, rhythmic percussion carrying across the water that Usopp identified first because he had been listening for it since they left Caliva, sitting at the bow every morning with his scope extended and his ears tuned. "Drums," he said. His voice was a whisper. "Different from before," Chopper said, coming to stand beside him. He was referring to Onigashima, to the drum that had preceded everything. This was different, external, present, the sound of real instruments being played by real hands on a real island. "These are celebration drums." "How do you know?" Yamato asked. Chopper listened. "The pattern. It's not battle rhythm and it's not morning rhythm. It's the kind that..." He stopped. Tilted his head. "It sounds like they're expecting someone." The island resolved out of the morning haze with a scale that no previous description had adequately prepared anyone for. Elbaf was large the way mountains are large, not just in measurement but in the quality of the largeness, the way the size communicated something beyond its own dimensions, a presence that the air around it seemed to acknowledge. The cliffs were enormous and carved with symbols that Robin, at the railing with her hands on the wood and her eyes moving systematically across the carved faces, identified in a rapid, almost breathless sequence. "Elder runes," she said. Some of these predate the Void Century." She moved along the railing. "This section here is a timeline. Events recorded in the Giant's oldest language. It runs..." She stopped. "Robin?" Nami said. "It runs to a gap," Robin said. "A deliberate gap in the record, left blank, with a symbol beside it that in the Giant's tradition means awaited." She looked at the symbol. "The symbol beside the gap is the sun." The dock was enormous, naturally. Giant scale, which meant the Sunny pulled into a berth that could have held four of her side by side and still had room. The dock would worn smooth by centuries of ships that the crew of the Sunny could not have lifted individually. Rope ladders had been lowered to accommodate regular-sized visitors, and at the top of each ladder stood a giant, which was a thing the crew had encountered before in the persons of Dory and Broggy, but which retained, at full Elbaf context, an impact that didn't diminish with familiarity. Usopp climbed the ladder first. This was not strategic and not discussed. He simply went first, moving up the rope with a speed that suggested he had made the decision before his brain had time to lodge its various professional objections, and he came over the top of the dock and stood at the feet of a giant who was looking down at him with an expression that resolved, over the course of 2 seconds, from formal greeting of visitors to something considerably more specific. Usopp, the giant said. The name in a giant's mouth was an event. That's me, Usopp said. The giant turned and shouted something in the giant's language, a word that the crew arriving behind Usopp couldn't translate but that carried unmistakably across the dock and into the settlement beyond it, and the drums changed pattern. Noticeably. Definitively. The celebration rhythm that Chopper had identified shifted into something faster and more specific. What did they say? Luffy asked Robin, coming over the ladder beside her. They said the warrior's companion has arrived, Robin said. She looked at Usopp. You are known here. Usopp's expression was a complicated map of pride and terror, with pride currently in the lead but only barely. I knew that, he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The giant who had greeted them was named Riskwa, a warrior of the elder rank, and she led them through streets scaled for beings twice their height toward the central hall of Elbaf with the kind of formal courtesy that communicated both respect and the specific wariness that Elbaf reserved for visitors who arrived by ship rather than invitation. Except they had arrived by invitation, in the sense that the awaited symbol on the cliff wall, and the changed drum pattern and the gathering crowd of giants lining the wide streets communicated arrival that had been expected. The crowd was extraordinary. Giants in the full range of their ages, elders with faces like carved stone, warriors with weapons that could have served as ship masts, children who were already